Good morning. It is 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It's Wednesday, so PMQs is on the way, which will be a large part of the reason why Rishi Sunak has tried to get it out there. If the Telegraph are correct, and I've got no reason to believe that they aren't, that Suella Braverman won't be investigated over her latest alleged breach of the ministerial code. And that's a wonderful illustration of how hard it is to follow politics at the moment. Because if you come from the evidence-based perspective that this lot couldn't knock the skin off a rice pudding or punch their way out of a wet paper bag, then you don't know whether to be disappointed, dismayed or delighted about the Suella Braverman news. If you're paying attention, that is. Because quite a lot of accounts from people a lot closer to the Conservative Party than I will ever be have it that she actually wants to get fired, ideally over some immigration-related issues, so that she can cultivate a miasma of martyrdom from the backbenches in expectation of defeat at the next general election and then launch a leadership bid. If I doubted it a few years ago through naivety and misplaced idealism, I no longer doubt it at all that these people live 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in pursuit entirely of personal ambition. They care not one jot about the country. It's quite incredible. It's not true of all Tories, historically. Far from it. I'm reading quite a lot about Stanley Baldwin at the moment, who's an absolutely fascinating character. But it is certainly true of the post-Brexit iteration. I mean, look, don't hate me. But Jeremy Hunt, I think, is motivated by some sense of public duty. He might be a whopping great balloon, but he doesn't seem to be waiting for the ball to come out the back of the scrum in the hope of being able to pick it up and hop over the try line. But you look at the last three. Look at Johnson, look at Truss and look at Sunak, and you tell me that they've ever in their puff dedicated a single moment to contemplating how they might improve the lives of the country's most deserving people. Politics is all about redistribution, and even if they did have an iota of a clue about how to introduce meaningful change, it would be about cultivating politics that encourages people to think that the redistribution of resources should come from the people below them rather than the people above them. This is why immigration rhetoric is so rancid. You persuade people that their unhappiness with their lot is caused by people who've got next to nothing. So look over there. You know how much money Sadiq Khan found yesterday? How much empty property Sadiq Khan found yesterday in conjunction with Westminster Council? £20 billion worth of property just sitting there empty while rich people get richer off the back of it. But hey, look, quick, over there. There's a refugee who's getting tuppence halfpenny a week in order to eat pot noodles all day. That's disgusting. We can't afford that. How's our infrastructure ever going to cut? It's actually redunculous, but there we are. So I don't know whether Suella Braverman will be kicking her heels today in frustration at the fact that she's still got to pretend that she's got the first idea what to do as Home Secretary, or whether she will be mighty relieved that on this occasion her apparent breach of the ministerial code is not going to be investigated. The Telegraph inevitably report it as Suella Braverman is not going to be sacked, which is a decision that probably should have been arrived at the end of an investigation by the Prime Minister's ethics advisor. But we should be thankful for small mercies. At least he's got an ethics advisor. And at least the ethics advisor hasn't resigned in protest yet, having become sick at being lied to, like the last one, or frustrated by the failure to get rid of a bully, like the one before, or no ethics advisor at all, like Liz Truss. Which brings us back to Boris Johnson. I think it brings us back to Boris Johnson. What's the best question to ask on this? 8 minutes after 10 is the time. The first thing to do is just to pause for a moment and have a little giggle together, I think, don't you? It's a stitch-up. It's a witch hunt. It's the woke mafia. It's the new elite. It's the anti-growth coalition. It's the tofu-eating wokerati. Who is it? Who's stitching him? It's the blob. They're all stitching him up. Infamy, infamy. They've all got it infamy. Boris Johnson and Donald Trump sound almost identical to each other. Not for the first time. And The differences being that I think Donald Trump's probably still got a better chance of getting back on the horse than Boris Johnson has. But this constant litany of whining, they must get so tired. Don't you think? Taking responsibility for nothing. Nothing's ever their fault. Everything's a conspiracy. Everything's a witch hunt. Everything's a stitch-up. Poor old Boris Johnson, 13 years in power, an 80-seat majority, over 80% of the UK media, absolutely supine in its sycophancy for his every utterance, and yet he is somehow the victim here. He is the one who is more sinned against than sinning. How do you keep that up? I honestly would love to know. I know you don't ring me anymore. I wish you would. I say that every day. But how do you keep up the idea that Boris Johnson is somehow, I don't know, more sinned against than sinning? The Brexit he sold you fell apart in your hands. And it was like the bloke in the transit van pulled up at the side of the road and told you he'd just been fitting some speakers in a millionaire's house around the corner and he had a couple left over that you could have for 25 quid and they were actually worth 2,500. But he needed the cash because it was his kid's birthday and he had to get home quick. So you hand over your 25 quid and he gives you a box that says really expensive speakers on it. That's Brexit. You get home, you open the box, it's got two bricks in it. You just bought 2 bricks for 25 quid. That's Boris Johnson. That's what he does. He drives around in a transit van trying to sell expensive speakers to people that are in reality bricks. But you're still clinging to the idea that he's a good lad. Still clinging to the idea that he's more sinned against than sinning. I mean, it is actually unbelievable when you turn to the front pages today. I mean, apart from the sensible ones, Johnson accused of new COVID breaches. That's all right. The Telegraph at least goes for it. But immediately, allies claim former PM is victim of political smear. Daily Mail, Boris threatens to sue Cabinet Office for COVID stitch-up. If you are a lawyer, could you, and this is a slightly rhetorical question in that I don't think there is an answer except he can't, could you give us a quick call and tell us on what possible grounds Boris Johnson could sue the Cabinet Office, headed up by Simon Case, who... did he appoint Simon Case or did he inherit Simon Case? I think he appointed Simon Case because he thought he'd be a soft touch. Simon Case, of course, the man that brought the distant cousin into Downing Street after, it's so hard to keep up, Richard Sharp had made Simon Case aware that there was this Canadian tycoon who wanted to guarantee a loan for Boris Johnson up to £800,000 that Richard Sharp failed to mention to the selection panel when he was applying to become chairman of the BBC. So, I mean, you see what I mean. Every rock you look under, do you know what you find? 10 more rocks. You look under them, do you know what you find? 10 more rocks. It's ridiculous. It is clearly ridiculous, and it won't go away until Boris Johnson goes away, because you'll always have this weird rump of people in Parliament and media who will defend his every utterance, who will, frankly, endorse and prove on a daily basis that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, I think he's in America at the moment, and not lose a single vote from that base, from that curious support. So here's the question for you. Knowing what you know and seeing what you've seen, hearing what you've heard, I feel the next line should rhyme like a Dr. Seuss couplet, shouldn't it? I haven't got anything, because the only thing I can think of that rhymes with heard, although it's appropriate to describing Boris Johnson, wouldn't be suitable for 12 minutes after 10 on a family radio programme. Nor, for the record, will the next image that I'm going to plant in your mind. But hey-ho, in for a penny, in for a pound. If it was reported that Boris Johnson had thrown a Winnie the Pooh themed orgy in Chequers that involved him running around the room covered in honey while people like Nadine Dorries, Jacob Rees-Mogg and David Frost queued up to lick it off him, would you, hand on heart, be shocked? In direct contravention of all lockdown laws, would you, hand on heart, be shocked if Boris Johnson had thrown a Winnie the Pooh themed orgy that involved Nadine Dorries, Jacob Rees-Mogg, David Frost, the entire comment desk of the Daily Telegraph, at least 5 broadcasters I can think of off the top of my head, and approximately 30% of the Parliamentary Conservative Party queuing up to lick honey from his quivering torso? Could you? Would you? Would you really be surprised? Mind bleach, Keith. Keith, mind bleach, please. Mind bleach, everybody. Because I wouldn't. I genuinely wouldn't. Not now. I wouldn't be even... I mean, it might raise an eyebrow at the detail, but not at the substance. The idea that he would do such a thing is perfectly plausible to me. And it's plausible to everybody, which means if you're listening to this thinking, oh, it's a stitch-up, oh, it's a witch hunt, you're already making excuses because you know that he probably did it. like he did all the other things he claimed he hadn't done. Do you remember? Do you remember the chronology of crapulence? Number one, there weren't any parties. Number two, there were parties, but I didn't know about them. Number three, there were parties, but I did know about them, but I didn't go to them. Number four, there were parties, but I did know about them, but I did go to them, but I didn't realise they were parties. Number five, it's a fair cop, Gov. I'll pay the fine. How? What's the word I even want? So I return to the well-trodden territory of Boris Johnson's utter moral corruption and the mystery of why people would put up with it. What is the word I even want? As families were saying goodbye to loved ones, essentially in hermetically sealed tents, Her Majesty the Queen sat isolated and alone on the very morning that members of Boris Johnson's top team had been staggering slaughtered out of Downing Street at the funeral of her late husband. How bent do you have to be? How boiled does your brain have to be to see this man as anything other than a deep, dark stain upon our democracy and our history? I do not know. I do not know. That's put me off honey for life, says at least one texter to the programme this morning, for which I can only apologise. That's the question, isn't it? That's the question. How plausible do you think it is that Boris Johnson was throwing illegal parties at his grace and favour country home Chequers? 0345 6060 973. And of course, we must, as always, acknowledge the existence of the boiled brain brigade by asking, why do people put up with it still? I mean, that's the real mystery here. As the Telegraph and the Mail and the rest of them, I mean, even the attempts to scupper the Windsor framework, which incidentally is a large part of the reason why yesterday's IMF figures were so good. The fact that makes investment into this country, or parts of this country, a lot more attractive than it was before the Windsor framework got through. So why, and when I say good, I just mean not as bad as the ones before, why do people still excuse him? The Brexit that he sold them has fallen apart in their hands. The lies that he told them have been completely exposed by events. The disgrace that he's brought upon them is completely contagious. Everyone who he touches ends up shamed. Most recently, I suppose, Richard Sharp or Dominic Raab. You'd take your pick on that, wouldn't you? Because Raab was his deputy as well. Richard Sharp, probably most obviously, a man with quite a nice reputation in the city and who sees himself as a big-shot philanthropist. He's dishing out cash all the time to dodgy think tanks, trying to surround himself with all the trappings of power and influence, gets himself into Downing Street because he used to be Rishi Sunak's boss at Goldman Sachs, makes himself useful, sorts out a little loan, helps out with a little loan. I say little, it's £800,000, but hey-ho, horses for courses. Lets it be known he wants to be chairman of the BBC. Oops, a daisy, suddenly becomes chairman of the BBC and then has to resign in disgrace. Why? Because he got the taint. What is it in Treasure Island? Is it the black spot? The pirates pass it around. You get the black spot, you're dead. Boris Johnson is a human black spot. You touch him, your career is dead. You'll end in disgrace. You'll be shamed. Or you'll end up with a column in the Daily Mail and a show on GBBs, which is, I guess, in many ways the media equivalent of abject eternal shame. So why? Question number one, do you think it's likely, possible, plausible that Boris Johnson threw illegal parties for friends and family at Chequers? 0345 6060 973. And if so, why so? If so, why so, sir, so? Why do you think it's plausible? What would you point to first, if I haven't already, and even perhaps if I have, as the evidence for or the basis for your position? And number two, I never get tired of asking this question because I never get tired of examining perspectives other than my own. Such is my curse. I'm always fascinated by people who are wrong. I mean people who disagree with me. Always. Why would anyone now still be clinging to the carcass of the idea that Boris Johnson is worthy of their support or their respect? How? Just tell me. If you don't want to ring me yourself, try and get your wife to do it. Tell me about the Boris Johnson fan in your life. Would you agree now that there is nothing that would prompt the scales to fall from their eyes? It's quite bizarre. 0345 6060 973. Mark, I can't describe Boris Johnson as a stubborn skid mark on the underpants of British politics because I reserve that description for Nigel Farage, who thankfully we haven't had much cause to talk about lately and hopefully never will again. But I suspect that's probably unlikely too. I'm keeping an eye on when he actually emigrates, as promised, having admitted that Brexit was a failure. But today it's back to Johnson. It's back to the other buttock on the Brexit backside. What is it about Boris Johnson that prompts some people to forgive him absolutely anything and everything? And how likely do you think it is that he threw illegal parties at Chequers for his family and his friends? 0345 6060 973. It's 10:18. 21 minutes after 10 is the time, and I don't want to drop anybody in it, so I'm not going to. I can't quite remember who it was who told me, but there's actually a very compelling and almost sympathetic account of how Boris Johnson and his mates ended up having so many parties during lockdown, and essentially, having the right old knees up Mother Brown while the rest of us couldn't even visit our mums or were waving at them through patio windows. I'll share that with you shortly, hopefully when I've remembered who it was that explained it to me, but not necessarily. I don't want to get the wrong person. 2 questions. Do you reckon it's possible? Could Boris Johnson possibly have thrown parties at Chequers in contravention of his own lockdown laws? 0345 6060 973. And given that most of us presumably will acknowledge that he could, what is it, even now, that sees him inspire loyalty in people who just haven't been let down by him yet, or who have been let down by him but somehow don't care? Dave's in Leicester. Dave, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Right, so I'm very angry, but not probably quite as angry as you.
I'm not really angry. I'm seeing the funny side today, Dave. I've decided to go pithy rather than that thing the Americans would say to describe anger.
And it's making me laugh as well. But, James, I think there's 2 camps. There's one camp that love Johnson. They fawn over him. He's like their messiah.
Yes.
He's entertaining, he's funny, he's a bumbling idiot. He must be fun when he's had a few to drink and all that sort of stuff. I think that's one camp. And then I think the other camp is a sinister camp.
Right.
They see him as the man to get the Conservative government after this one re-elected. So I think that those that are pushing to get him in place, because ultimately they get rid of him again and they install somebody like Suella, who in absolutely no way could win a general election for the Conservative Party in this country.
But you see, the problem with your analysis, I think, is that the only people who like Suella Braverman are almost certainly Boris Johnson fans.
Yeah, but you see, they know that Johnson can't deliver because he's not like Suella Braverman. She's just facing everything down.
No, she's hideous, and he is, whether you like it or not, he is clubbable. I mean, in every sense of the word, Boris Johnson is clubbable, but in the sense that we mean in this context, that people still think that he's electable.
Yeah, definitely. He's definitely electable.
How hard do you have to hold your nose? I mean, you'd be holding your nose so hard that your fingers are touching. To say, I don't mind this, and I don't mind that, and I don't mind the other. Do you think anybody believes it's impossible that he threw parties for his friends and family at his Grace and Favour mansion while the rest of us couldn't even visit our mums?
Even those people that follow him like he is the Messiah, they know that he's had parties there.
Hang on. Nobody knows for sure, I don't think. Well, I mean, I know he wrote them in his diary, but whether they were parties in direct contravention of the law, I do not know.
But, James, think about it. He appointed these really very expensive lawyers on the public purse. Yes. And they've seen something in information.
Yes, that's the remarkable bit of this story, Dave. Yeah. They've had a look through his diary. It says, had a great old party with Pops last night. And you go, hang on a minute, you've got what? So they have to give it to the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office are bound by the Civil Service Code to then give it to the police. If a civil servant suspects that a crime has been committed, they are required to tell the police.
Yeah. So if his lawyers have seen information, let's face it, most lawyers stand in court and they argue the case for their clients. They have to hold their nose sometimes, knowing full well that what they're saying is ridiculous.
But not full well. They can never know it full well. I know that we all think they probably sometimes do, but they would say, at some point a lawyer will say, don't tell me that. I don't want to hear that. I can't go into court and defend you if you tell me that.
Exactly. But like all people, there's somebody's recorded something somewhere and they've read it and they've said, hang on a minute, we can't.
And there it is. And yet there are people queuing up now to call it a stitch-up. I mean, it was a stitch-up last time, wasn't it? It's just cake. It's just incredible. And I almost wish... Well, I did vote for him, actually, in 2008. I was about to say I almost wish I hadn't been a sworn critic of Boris Johnson for my entire career, but I haven't been. I fell for it very early, very, very briefly. I fell for it, so I'm allowed to marvel at the continuing delusion of people who are yet to, I'd say, wake up. Thank you, Dave. Millen's in Paris. Millen, what's going on here?
I want to answer the question of why people still believe that he's a competent leader or would still vote for him.
Yes. They're two different things, aren't they, I guess?
Not in my answer, but they probably are.
No, go on then. Go on then.
I'm going to draw on the work of a media critic and philosopher called Dan Olson, and he was speaking about flat Earth and why people believe in it when it's patently ridiculous.
Yes. Don't at me for that. Take it. I'll give you Millen's number in Paris. Don't want to ring me to tell me that the Earth is actually flat. All right, I haven't got the bandwidth or the switchboard. Go on.
People, if believe in flat Earth because if it were to be true, it would validate all their pre-existing beliefs and biases. And in the same way, if they were to accept that Boris Johnson had the failings that everyone says he does, it would invalidate their pre-existing belief structure, and that is too much to take.
And a big part of that is Brexit, of course.
Yes.
What was the tipping point then? The referendum, really, the win. We won, and that joy that people tell me they felt at that victory is almost becoming, I don't know if identitarian is the right way, it's becoming part of their identity. And if we admit the truth about Boris Johnson, we admit the truth about ourselves.
And everything else that we've been lied to about.
Yeah, immigration isn't the root of my own personal problems. Brexit isn't going to improve my life. Foreigners aren't all out to get us. The EU isn't actually the Fourth Reich. Bendy bananas are not the be-all and the end-all of British domestic policy. So the scale of the ridiculousness you would have to acknowledge on your own part if you acknowledge the awfulness of Boris Johnson is just too great to contemplate.
And after 7 years of this being part of your beliefs and part of your morality, in fact, it's really hard. That's become part of your personality. Yeah. It's really hard to just say that was wrong.
It's brutal, isn't it? Gary texted while you were talking for a similar theme, tweeted to say the mountain of denial is too high to climb down from. So head down, keep excusing. It's the same sort of sentiment. Right. Yeah, I like it. I mean, the problem is that we can't get inside the head of the people up the mountain, and I would love to. I always want to. When I was in the foothills of that mountain, I hadn't thought about stuff very deeply, and he hadn't done much, right? So, Mayor of London, what's it called, an amnesty for illegal immigrants. I just thought that'd be good. Bring people into the legal economy who are currently in the illegal economy. They pay tax. They won't be living in appalling some nice stuff. Saw him on the telly, seemed quite funny. Met him a couple of times. Very, very clubbable. Lots of bonhomie. About 10 minutes after he became mayor, I think it was the fire station situation that made me realise what an absolute fraud he was. But hey, I fell for it. I can admit it. Why do some people now find it so hard to admit? Answer, because they've fallen for so much more. They've kind of fallen for everything. They've fallen for a worldview that they think Johnson endorses, just like Trump. And that worldview is pretty ugly. And white supremacism on Trump's part, I don't think that's the case with Johnson. I don't want it to be the case with Johnson. But he does seem to appeal to the same people that have got MAGA on their Twitter profiles, like Andrea Jenkins, the Conservative MP and passionate Boris Johnson fan. She had MAGA all over her profile, even as the full extent of Donald Trump's moral depravity became clear. Well, what is it? What is it that prevents these people from being able to disassociate or detach themselves from him? And the obvious answer is that they actually don't want to, which is arguably even more terrifying than the idea that they are incapable of doing so. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines. It is 33 minutes after 10 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We've got the letters coming, the exchange of letters between the Prime Minister, who has refused to order an investigation into the Home Secretary, and indeed the Home Secretary, who has, I think my first theory is not the case here. I think, judging by the tone and indeed the length of her letter, she didn't want to go this time. She's not quite ready to pitch camp on the back benches as a martyr and begin the long and inexorable process of her attempt to get more than 27 votes in the next Conservative leadership election. Forgive me if I've misremembered that number. 34 minutes after 10. Questions. I guess the central one is a bit rhetorical. Do you find it plausible that Boris Johnson, as is alleged today as a consequence of his decision not to pay his own lawyers, but to get you to pay for them instead. Do you find it plausible that he threw parties for friends and family during the pandemic lockdown at his grace and favour mansion Chequers? I don't think anyone, honestly, would find it implausible. I probably should have phrased that question differently. But hey-ho, it's 10:34 now. It's too late to change course. Therefore, the second question becomes, how can they still be defending him? How can they still be defending him? After Owen Paterson, after the illegal prorogation of Parliament, after lying to the late Queen, after the parties, after Chris Pincher? That's just off the top of my head. There's at least 10 more examples right up there that could have ended other careers but didn't end his. How can they still be sticking? I just don't get it. Unless we take that philosopher Dan Olson explained to us by Milan in Paris analysis that it's like believing in the flat earth. You've just got so much invested in it now that if you abandon any of it, you abandon all of it. And that includes your sense of self. That includes your idea of who you are. Let's think about, forgive me, this isn't quite as bad as imagining Winnie the Pooh themed orgies where Boris Johnson runs around the room covered in honey waiting for people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and David Frost. And Nick Timothy would be there, wouldn't he, probably? Basically anyone who writes for the Daily Telegraph, they'd all be queuing up to lick it off him. But I just want you to think about Nadine Dorries for a moment. A very brief moment. If Nadine Dorries somehow was forced to acknowledge all of the awful things that Boris Johnson has done, what would happen to her? Do you see what I mean? So her and Rees-Mogg have got TV shows now, which are the sort of continuity Boris Johnson brigade. It's like these weird outposts in the UK media where they'll continue to pretend that he never did anything wrong and he should still be Prime Minister. And if he was, everything would be brilliant because there's a wonderful Brexit. It just goes to a different school. And he was the victim of a witch hunt rather than the victim of the consequences of his own actions. It's utterly delusional, but it's real. But I know what they get out of it. They get a career of sorts out of it. What do their disciples get out of it? So just imagine for a minute that they had to surrender this nonsense that he's anything other than a blithering idiot, a deeply dishonest blithering idiot who, to slightly misquote his housemaster from the early 80s at Eton, he honestly thinks it's churlish of us to expect him to abide by the network of obligations which binds the rest of society. It's there. It's been there since the start. What happens to them if they give up on it? What happens to them if they surrender it? 0345 6060 973. 10:37 is the time. Anna is in Woking. Anna, what do you think?
I just first time calling in, James.
Welcome.
So hello.
Hello. Thank you.
Boris makes me incredibly angry,
right,
to the point that I get quite emotional about it, because my wonderful dad passed away on the 10th of November 2020 with COVID.
I'm sorry.
No one was allowed to see him in the hospital. No one was even allowed to speak to him. And that evening was one of the evenings where I believe there was a big party.
Right.
And to see him now and know that this is, all of this, or the parties are coming out in the wash now, even 3 years later, it just brings it back every single time. And how people can even contemplate him becoming Prime Minister again is just utterly bewildering.
Do you think they do? Because I'm never quite sure. The circumstances in which he could come back to the front of the Conservative Party are almost beyond imagination, but so is so much of what's happened in the last few years, up to and including the parties that you described.
Exactly, but my dad was one of those people who
really
worshipped Boris. My dad was he was in Hillingdon, so Uxbridge was his area, and obviously Boris was his MP.
Yes.
He was also his mayor of London before that. And my dad thought he was brilliant. He was, this charismatic, wonderful man who made everyone laugh, who, really kind of understood the people, he thought. And yet... It's
amazing, isn't it? What was your dad most impressed by, do you think? Boris Johnson's brave resistance and successful campaign against the third runway at Heathrow, which, of course, was in the middle of his constituency, or the way that he ensured that there'd be absolutely no checks whatsoever at the border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
I know. It's just ridiculous,
It's heartbreaking.
Isn't it? I know.
So what do you put it down to? I mean, Dad was obviously a bright chap. It just didn't think about things too much. Just knew what he liked and liked what he knew. How do we account?
Yeah, I think so. I think people they latch on to people that they feel a bond with, and then they can't see past the bad stuff that they do. They're blindsided by it.
Yeah, and it makes conversations like this quite difficult, actually, because we speak in quite pejorative terms about these people because we go for the tips of the iceberg. We go for the Rees-Moggs or the Dorrieses or the Daily Telegraph comment writers or the Tufton Street ghouls or whoever it is that's lionising him this week. But we forget about nice people, mums and dads, brothers and sisters who just sort of swallowed the snake oil, really. And they're still there. Absolutely. I'm sorry for your loss. Do you think, I hope this isn't an inappropriate question, do you think your dad would still be waving his Boris Johnson flag if he was still with us today, Anna?
Do you know, sadly I do.
Oh, boy. There it is.
I know, and that's right there is the problem, isn't it? It's people that have been brainwashed by his...
Why I asked. It is, yeah, and I hope it does. I'm sure it doesn't sully all the happy memories you have of him. But right up to and including the Winnie the Pooh themed orgy at Chequers, which is for the moment a figment of my imagination. But how surprised would you really be if it turned out to be true? Nadine Dorries in the corner dressed up as Eeyore, Jacob Rees-Mogg bouncing around the room like Tigger. Boris Johnson covered in honey in his Winnie the Pooh suit, waiting for everyone to come up. I'll stop it. They're shouting, stop it at me now. Why? Everyone likes... One of my colleagues I've just discovered has got a Winnie the Pooh tattoo, which I've now ruined forever. I feel like I owe her an apology, if nobody else. 10:41 is the time. Richard is in Tunbridge Wells. Richard, what's going on?
Well, you've just ruined Winnie the Pooh for me forever.
I'm sorry.
Thank you for that.
Yes, you're not alone.
That's all right.
I do apologise.
That's okay. I've got an Eeyore stuffed toy being repurposed that I'm getting back. Yeah, anyway. I just wanted to say that I'm so angry and frustrated that this blithering idiot is still dominating our news.
Yeah. Well, hang on. I mean, he's not, is he? He's the top story today. He's the top story today, but... To be fair, we barely met. We just throw him in. He's an aside now, really. He's a reminder of how bad things can get. He's no longer in power. He's never going to go away.
Him.
Yeah, I know, but he's not dominating our news unless you're speaking in the context of the last 40 minutes as opposed to the last 40 days.
That's a fair point.
Yeah,
I have one small thing to say.
Of course.
Is that during the time that he was throwing all of these parties, I turned down and I cancelled a train ticket from Kent up to Newcastle to meet my biological mother, which would be my first and only chance to do that.
Oh, Richard. For health reasons, because you didn't want to risk her health or yours. Or
anybody's health.
So you couldn't do it.
You can't travel. You just stay put.
You do.
She passed away a bit shortly afterwards.
Oh, my friend. And that's the first thing you think of. That's the first thing you think of when you see all of these stories about
all of it.
Parties.
I mean, I could have been out partying. I quite like parties. I quite like booze. I really don't want to think about Winnie the Pooh that way again.
I feel bad about that now. I mean, what can I say? Is there anything I can do to restore Winnie the Pooh to his previous position in your affections?
Don't. Do not. I just never mention it again.
All right,
but that's the point. There was literally, it was just you plebs, I think that refers to us, do this, do what we say, we'll do whatever the heck we want without
and you can suck
any
it up.
kind of regardless.
Would you like to hear my account of how it happened without it looking quite as contemptuous as it currently looks, or shall I wait for
No, go for it. I would love to hear that.
Because it was a very intelligent person. I'm 99% sure who it was, but until I'm 100% sure, I can't say so. If anyone who listens to Full Disclosure religiously is listening to this, then they'll know. They'll be able to confirm or deny who it is. But they knew what the challenge was. They couldn't really tell us, right? But in order to protect vulnerable people in particular, they needed,
like my biological mother,
like your your biological mother. They had to drop the portcullis and pull up the drawbridge. So they had to introduce a lockdown that was highly fearful, fear-based, and effective. Whether that was true or not is not the conversation that we're having now. But the decision they took was that they needed to terrorize people into compliance, largely to protect the huge numbers, much bigger numbers than most of us appreciated, of vulnerable people, right? So they understood that the risk to non-vulnerable people was not as great, perhaps, as they portrayed it to be, in order to frighten us into protecting the people who needed to be protected. And you can see why they did that. There were people marching around the place saying, I'm not vulnerable. Why should I obey any rules? I'm not vulnerable. Everyone else. So
yeah, I remember the call-ins at the time, yeah.
And they're still around. I mean, they've got their own TV station now. So... So when they thought that they'd pulled that off, when they thought that they had secured sufficient compliance to protect the vulnerable, then they really relaxed and started behaving within the boundaries of Downing Street and Chequers, it would appear, in the way that they did. So it doesn't excuse them or exonerate them or change the fact that they were breaking the laws that they wrote and the rest of us were abiding by, but it offers a psychological defense that is not quite as depressing or as depraved as the alternatives.
Well, I would just like to one day see him face to face and ask him to explain to me why my one chance to meet the woman who birthed me.
Oh, Richard.
If that makes sense.
Of course it does. I'm the same. I don't know if you know that. I was adopted.
That's why I thought you might take this, because I know you're adopted as well. You know,
I can only imagine what
we should get T-shirts printed out, I guess. But I turned that down because it was supposed to be the right thing to do, and I still think it was the right thing to do.
Yes, no, don't ever doubt that. But it was him doing the wrong thing that just throws a slightly odd shadow over the whole memory.
Endlessly doing the wrong thing. Endlessly doing the wrong thing. And like your previous caller, was it Anna?
Yes.
Was saying her father, who unfortunately passed away as well, and commiserations to her.
Of course.
How has he conned so many people into thinking that he's this brilliant, wonderful raconteur when he is just a blithering idiot who can't even comb his hair?
He can comb his hair.
He can, and then he messes it up every time he goes.
He combed it, I think. Didn't he comb it for his select committee appearance? He combed it for something.
And he did, yes.
Because that's me. That's my serious. Mummy's little soldier's got his serious hair today.
And he looked like a bad impersonator of himself because he'd done his hair.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Anyway, James, I'm sorry. I just wanted...
thank you. I'm glad I was here. Glad I was here for you to do that today, Richard. And I can, as you say, have a slightly better grasp, perhaps, of what you must have been through than others would. But of course, there'll be empathy aplenty being offered towards you and sympathy. Look after yourself. 10:47 is the time. That's the bit I think of whenever people say, "Oh, it doesn't matter," or "It's no big deal," or "The world has moved on." Do you ever hear that? The world has moved on. Oh, it's moved on. No, that's people saying, please move on. Please. I know it hasn't moved on because people like Richard are never going to forget the difference between their behaviour and the behaviour of the people who were nominally in charge. Please move on. Please stop focusing on how awful my hero is. That's what they mean when they say, please move on. Pretty much in the context of anyone in this government. You hear someone say, please move on, or the world... No, if you hear someone say the world's moved on, they're saying, please move on, because the longer we talk about this, the more stupid I feel. As not just a supporter, but in my line of work, an active cheerleader for the madness that's been inflicted on this country. People, you know what? A while ago, people were even saying, nobody wants to talk about Brexit anymore. Oh, the world's moved on. Nobody wants to talk about Brexit. The only people who don't want to talk about Brexit anymore are the people that are at least honest enough with themselves to admit that they made a terrible mistake when they told you to vote for it, but not yet honest enough with you to admit that out loud. So next time you hear, the world's moved on, just have a think about who benefits from the idea that the world has moved on, if not the person that sold you the dodgy speakers in the first place, or the clown in the passenger seat trying not to giggle while it happened. It's 10:48. It is 10:52. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the conversation is something of a Groundhog Day, I concede, about Boris Johnson, about parties, about, I don't know quite what the word is. Is it Teflon? It doesn't seem strong enough. About the way in which he has been shown to be all of the things his critics told you he was, and yet his fan club still persists. It's hard to measure how big it is because they lie so much. They lie about his approval ratings. They lie about how and why the last general election was won. They lie about Brexit. They lie about everything, really. And yet the rest of us just sit here as baffled, perhaps, today as we were at the very outset. So what do you reckon? Where does that come from? And does anyone want to have a go at explaining to me why they don't think it's possible that he was having parties at Chequers or having visits from friends and family when the rest of us weren't allowed to? If you want to have a crack at no, absolutely no chance. What, Boris Johnson doing that sort of thing? Don't be ridiculous. Then I'll put you straight to the front of the queue. But you've got to be serious. I don't want any self-appointed comedians ringing in. I've got that covered. Nick's in Lambeth. Nick, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Nick.
Yes, I 100% think that he went to all the parties.
How dare you? What evidence have you got for this vicious slur?
Well, exactly. But my point really is about why he's popular and what he appeals to. And I think that it's actually very hard to be a very good person. It takes a lot of energy, especially in an increasingly progressive, the last 5 years, an awful lot of societal changes, and they take effort and they take energy to be a good person. But then someone who endorses the laziness in people, he says, it's all right to lie, it's all right to deny that, it's all right to make judgments about that person's skin colour, it's all right to brush over how that person identifies. That's quite easy to do. And so you see someone in power and go, oh, that's okay. So I don't necessarily mean that he appeals to 100% of that in every.
No, but we've all got that. We've all got that, haven't we? We all know that doing the right thing is more tiring than doing the wrong thing. It depends on the volume of your conscience and a million other variables. But the people who come along, and it works two ways, because the media supporters of Boris Johnson, the loudest ones, are the ones that are most desperate to prove that everybody is actually corrupt. So whenever a member of the quotes, liberal elite, end quotes, does something that demonstrates their fallibility in a complicated world, your far-right hate sites and your Daily Mail columnists desperate to pretend that that's proof. That's why the curry thing came along, wasn't it? Keir Starmer's curry was desperate attempt to prove that they're all just as bad, and that lets me off from trying to be better. Anyone who looks like they're trying to be better must be a wrong 'un and must be brought down, which is why, of course, Andrew Neil's Spectator magazine invented the words virtue signalling, the phrase virtue signalling.
Right. Well, I think he's an embodiment of
the denigration of decency.
Yes. And
I like it.
There was an interview a long time ago of somebody on a street somewhere being asked, quite a young girl on her lunch break, if she liked Boris Johnson. And she said, I like him because he lies and we all lie. Yeah. And so it just thought, that's like me.
I mean, we do all lie, but some of us feel bad. Some of us feel bad about it, and some of us apparently don't. And the ones that don't, or the ones that don't want to, are going to love him. Maybe.
But if you're making the effort not to, he's not your man.
That's remarkable, isn't it? I like it.
Yeah.
I like it a lot, and it's quite simple. And the problem, again, with all of these analyses is the people, unlike perhaps the young woman doing that vox pop, the people we're describing may not join us in admitting that description of them is accurate. But that idea, I do find this very interesting, the desperation to prove that everyone is fallible when nobody claims to be infallible. The desperation to prove that everyone is fallible from that kind of far-right Nazi conference school of British media is off the charts and deeply intriguing, because it highlights exactly what Nick describes, is desperation to prove that anyone who's at least trying to do the right thing must be fraudulent, must be lying, and then the people who are obviously and blatantly lying somehow achieve heroic status. David's in Washington, in Tyne and Wear. David, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. I'd like to talk to you about sunk cost fallacy.
Yes.
Okay.
You've only got a couple of minutes.
Well, only because obviously that term, coined by psychologists, exactly describes what's going on now.
It does.
Right? And if you link that to confirmation bias, so you have people who've sunk so much into Boris, into Brexit and everything else, they can't back off because they've sunk so much in it. And what they then do is resort to confirmation bias by not listening to you, only reading the Telegraph, only reading the Mail, only watching TV
Fingers in your ears, kazoo in your gob. Just don't, keep shutting it. And that's where phrases like witch hunt and stitch up and it's only cake and hashtag bring back Boris, you just do that. You keep shouting those things so loudly that the truth and reality can't get in.
cut out the reality. But I mean, the fact that this sunk cost fallacy idea has been around for a long time, originally used to describe financial
people
systems,
giving more money to the person that had conned them.
Yeah, and keep going because they've sunk so much in, and now it's exactly the same. It's if you like, it must be human nature at some point to want to not believe that you were wrong.
Of course,
and then you shut out all of the noise that keeps saying you were wrong, you were wrong, you were wrong, to such an extent that you get this, you get GB News, you get all of the, the self-perpetuating, the headlines in quotation marks. Boris on the way back in quotation marks.
Yeah.
He's not. It just helps fuel that confirmation bias because you've sunk so much into where you are.
Can we help them at all?
Because I don't know. I think what happens is if you look at Boris's crowd, it's not growing. Trump's crowd isn't growing because once they've been exposed, those who are about to invest have probably got more information. Do you just
wonder what happens if the big guns of the British media turn their guns again in his defence? You'd probably still bank on the Telegraph. I don't know, actually. I should sort of step back from that. I don't know. I guess in the absence of anybody else. And then if they do that, and if someone comes along who sort of manages to blend immigration concerns with base racism again as effectively as sort of recent prancers on the national stage, you just don't know what happens. What you do know is he's such an opportunist, he would grab any opportunity, however ridiculous. Thank you. Sunk cost fallacy, a flat earth theory. Clever bunch, my callers, aren't they? They show me up every day. I've got a topic next. I've touched on it in the last hour. I wonder if you can work out what it is. Find out after the news. It is 3 minutes after 11. If you're waiting for Rishi Sunak to publish the advice upon which he has based his decision that there is no need for further investigation into Suella Braverman, then I've got some very, very important advice for you. Don't hold your breath. Okay, there you go. You can write that down. Okay, I like this story a lot. I think this is absolutely fascinating, but the challenge I have set myself, and I have chosen to accept, is to make it fascinating for you. So, a full list of all the empty homes across every London borough has been released, which shows that a total of 30,000 properties are currently being wasted. Okay? That's 30,000 properties. I think that's a more important figure than the estimated value of the homes, which stands at £2.2 billion. There are exceptional examples, including a property in Knightsbridge, which would therefore be worth a tidy sum, that has been empty for almost a decade. I understand the political impetus to do something about this. I really do, and I share it. But at the same time, the primacy of property is fairly clear, isn't it? You own something, then you can, within the law, do what you want with it. So the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is making noises about trying to do something about this. I'm not clear yet. I can ask him tonight, actually. I'm doing an event with Sadiq Khan at the South Bank. I don't know if there, I think there's some tickets left. He's launching his book, so if you want to come along to that, it would be lovely to see you. But he describes it as a scandal, which is just true. You think of a housing crisis or a housing shortage, the first thing you would think of, I think, is how many empty houses are there? Can I tell you something funny? Do you want to hear something funny? So I have these weird ideas sometimes about what I'd do if I was in charge. And one of the first things I'd do if I was in charge is do some sort of audit, not of just empty buildings, but of space. So quite often you look at and you think, what's up there on the 15th floor of that? What's up there on the 4th floor of that theatre or something? I know it's weird and I know it's utterly unworkable, but I'm quite a strange person sometimes. And I love the little houses that someone has spotted. You can just slot in to a relatively small space between two other houses. So I would, if I were in charge, I would set up a unit called the Space Finders. I'd give them a theme tune as well. Space Finders. And they drive around London or your town. I mean, this could work anywhere. In a little van with Space Finders written on the right of it, on the side of it. And they'd look for stuff, especially if it was municipally owned land, especially if it was council owned or government owned. So, you know, I don't want to build on playgrounds outside schools, but if there's a sort of bit of land somewhere that used to be part of it was like a car park for a building that's not a library. And do you see what I mean? Does anybody do? There's probably people listening going, "Oh, I've been doing that job for 25 years." Well, you're not doing it very well, are you, mate? Because there's all sorts of property shortages going on in this town that I call home. So you just have that idea of we've got to try and find space. So it started off with me worrying about homeless people, but obviously you can't just order someone to turn their attic into a flat for anybody. That just wouldn't be fair. But the appetite to find new space, not just to build, but to also find new space, seems to have disappeared. And then, as is often the case, one of the first messages to come in to the programme when I embark upon a YOY type introduction like this comes from Scotland, where Ben tells me you get hammered by a much higher council tax bill for owning an empty property, or for keeping a property empty, as it were. And I could live with that with my eye, for a million years, but I don't know how much difference it would make, especially not to the properties that are likely to be making up the bulk of this £20 billion. So the Mayor of London is working with Westminster City Council, which is a very, very conservative council, to call on the government to implement a range of measures. And there are some suggestions about what those measures would involve, and they do, as Ben suggested they should, reflect the situation in Scotland. You would have a devolution of powers so that local councils can set higher rates of council tax on vacant properties. So absentee international investment is the problem here, i.e., for a long time, and I think still, albeit this seems likely to be in retreat, for a long time, one of the best assets you could buy on the global market was property in the United Kingdom, originally in London, but subsequently elsewhere. You would literally buy a flat. It didn't matter whether there was someone living in it or not, because you were wealthy enough that the rent wouldn't make that much difference to your income, but the appreciation in the cost of the property itself would. And these are the people. Do you remember another weird thing I told you? It's actually similar, this. So it comes from a similar theme. I don't do much drive. If you're wondering why I spend my life wandering around looking at stuff and having strange thoughts, it's because I don't do much driving. If you don't drive everywhere, your inner life is a lot richer than it is if you do drive everywhere. You notice stuff and you learn stuff and you think about stuff. When we first moved to Leicester Square, is Westminster Council Labour now? Good grief, you live and learn, don't you? Oh, well, that explains why they're getting involved in this, because normally you'd think historically they'd be protecting the interests of people who own £20 million properties that have remained empty. Was that at the last? No, that wasn't at the last one, because that wasn't in London. Anyway, I digress. It's not like I'm a national radio presenter based in London who should probably know about these things. That would be really embarrassing. So when we first moved to Leicester Square, which was how many years ago? Not long ago. There was a pub that I really liked the look of. There was an old pub down near Orange Street, and it was empty. It was boarded up, and I used to walk past it every day. I toyed with the idea of trying to get the boss here to buy it and open it up as a sort of staff pub. I was younger then and still had time to visit pubs and enjoy them without waking up the next morning feeling like I'd been in the ring with Tyson Fury. I didn't in the end, but I used to walk past it every day thinking that is so odd, because that pub has been boarded up. And obviously when we first moved here, it had been boarded up for quite a long time. But then the longer we stayed here, the more puzzling it became that the pub was still boarded up, until the latest massive property development in Leicester Square was unveiled. The pub was knocked down, and the land on which it stood is now part of a massive multi-gazillion pound hotel complex. And you realise in that moment why the pub was boarded up for years, because the person that owned it, or the person who owned the freehold, is not playing the game that you and I play. They're not playing the, crikey, how are we going to get to the end of the year? Or when am I going to be able to afford to retire? Or can we pay more off on the mortgage this month? Or are we going to be good for the rent? They're not playing that game. They're playing a game that is so long, you and I can't really begin to understand it. I usually mention trees at this point. Do you know why? I usually mention trees at this point because if you are an aristocrat and you own a stately home, you are going to plant trees that won't be enjoyed properly until your great-great-grandson has inherited your title. But the way they think, this isn't a criticism, by the way, and it's a sad state of affairs in terms of inequality, but it's a perfectly reasonable way to behave in terms of reality. The way they think is generational. It's amazing that. If I was cleverer, I'd work it out better. The way that you can define somebody's socioeconomic status by the size of the cycle in which they live financially. So some people are living within almost an hourly financial cycle. A homeless person is living in an hourly, how much money can I get this hour? And then what am I going to do with it? And then someone else might be living in a daily financial cycle or a weekly financial cycle. I'm getting paid on the nail. I'm getting paid a day rate. Am I going to be all right this week? I'm going to. Most of us probably monthly. Some of us annually. Some people way beyond that. Once you've got capital, you're thinking in terms of decades. You're looking at investments coming to fruition years hence. So you live in a country where you could walk past 10 people in 10 minutes and they're all living in different financial universes. There's a person there who's living in an hourly cycle and a person there who's living in a generational cycle. He's making financial decisions based on where his great-great-grandson will be in 150 years' time. And that's why you leave a pub boarded up, because you're thinking about what you're going to get for it when a big property developer comes in, as they inevitably will, and builds an enormous hotel on the site of where your pub is. So why am I going to faff around for the next 10 years trying to run a pub or finding a tenant to put in it? I own it. I've got the freehold. It's here. And that is why I think this story about empty property is so poignant, but also so complicated. Julie points out, in many ways, my Space Finders idea is a bit like why William the Conqueror did the Doomsday Book. I hadn't thought of that. But you're kind of right, except he was just trying to find out how much he now owned. He sent them all out into the country to write down everything so that he could, divvy it up and dish it out to, crikey, this is almost like I planned it, so that he could divvy it up and dish it out to precisely the sort of people whose descendants are still living generationally and making decisions based on where their great-great-great-grandsons will be in 200 years' time. Good Lord. So, what do we think about this? The temporary takeover of empty homes using empty dwelling management orders is one of the ideas that the Mayor is suggesting. He says, over the last few years, we've started building a record number of homes for Londoners, but there's still a long way to go. Ministers should start by making it easier for councils to bring long-term empty homes back into use so we can continue building a fairer and more prosperous London for everyone. So there is no way that politicians should be allowed to tell you what you can do with your television or what you can do with your car, actually. I know they can tell you where you can drive it and things like that, but they shouldn't be able to tell you that other people are going to be allowed to drive it tomorrow. They shouldn't be allowed to tell you what you can do with the contents of your fridge, should they? They shouldn't be able to knock on your door and say, hang on a minute, we need 4 sticks of celery and a jar of peanut butter because we're giving it to the person over the right. Do you see what I mean? We all accept that property is... What's the word I'm looking for? I was about to say property belongs to us, but that seemed like such an obvious and crass statement that I stopped myself saying it until I realised that we're having a conversation about property that in a way wouldn't belong to you if politicians were allowed to get stuck in and reallocate it. So you'd still own it, but the government or the local government would be able to temporarily take over it. So there are 2 topics here, and not for the first time on this programme. One of them is pretty practical, and one of them is quite philosophical. The practical, and I think for once I like them equally, not even 52-48. I think I like them equally. I like the idea of finding out what you think about the idea of empty properties being essentially co-opted by councils. Okay? 0345 6060 973. And by practicalities, I mean, will it work? And by philosophical, I mean, is it fair? So would it work? You might be a bit more involved in the property system than I am. Here is a house Here are the doors, here are the people. Here is a house. It's been empty for, shall we say, 2 years. Right? We're taking it over. I let a house once, and it was a social housing organisation. They do everything. You just give them the keys, that's it. You never need to get involved again. They even guarantee an income. So would you get an income? I suppose you'd get an income, wouldn't you? Because people have to pay to live. So you're going to get an income, but you haven't got any say. Unless you move someone into it, we will. I'm talking myself into this, actually. So here is a house. It's been empty for 2 years. We track you down. We say, what's the plan? You've got 6 months to get someone into it. Otherwise, we will. And if you don't want to get someone into it, can we do it now? No loss. You know, we'll sign all the contracts. You'll get an income for it, and we'll do all the usual deposits and damage. But you are obviously rich enough not to need the income from this property. But we are not. We are too poor in terms of how much property we have to allow that to happen in our area. I am talking myself into this idea with every passing minute. And that's the question, isn't it? What on earth is wrong with it? Here you are, property owner, rich enough not to need the property. There's someone over there who needs a home. Not a homeless person. That's a slightly different proposition, but someone who is a victim of the current housing crisis. So, look, no sort of thumb screws, nothing like that. If you want to put it on the open market yourself, that's absolutely fine. But if you're not going to put it on the open market, either for rent or for sale, then we are going to fill it with people who will pay. And we'll take care of everything else. We'll take care of all the paperwork. Because for me, and this is where it gets philosophical, there is something fundamentally ridiculous, redonkulous about the idea that we can be talking almost every day about our housing crisis and how hard it is for people to live in the property they want to live in, harder perhaps than ever, and yet there are 30,000 properties in London alone that are currently standing empty. It's more ridiculous than anything else in the context of a housing crisis. I know, it's a quick shout to the racists, it's all the fault of immigrants, but there are 30,000 empty properties in this town. And God knows how many families looking to move. And every family that moves creates more movement, and it's you know how it works. So just straight up, what do we think? I'd love to talk to you. I don't want to have a row. If you've got an empty property and you're absolutely bloody outraged at the idea of the government coming along and making you put people in it, what do the rest of us think of it? Practically and philosophically. Because I tell you what, if I quite liked it at 11 o'clock this morning, I blooming love it now. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. What do you think of that then? 22 after 11 is the time. There's a property. It's not got anyone in it. Have a proper butchers. Decide what's going on. Work out who owns it. Order them to put people in it. Or do it yourself and pay them. What's the problem? Jonty's in St John's Wood. Jonty, what do you reckon?
James, I love the idea, but for the opposite reason that you give. I'm a landlord who can't afford to keep a property empty, but can't afford to fill it.
Tell me
it's
more.
a kind of a scenario you haven't imagined. There's a lot of landlords have, and I'll explain it. Up north, the rents are very much lower. So if I have a rent of $400 a month, I literally, with the mortgage, and especially with them trebling recently, I can't afford to fix everything that needs fixing to make it habitable for a tenant.
Right.
So, for example, I have a property up north where I have to pay at least £6,000 to put it into decent repair, which I just don't have with the rent that was coming in at $400. Then what happens is the council charge you for council taxes. It's empty, and then they regulate you and charge you for that as well. So they put expense after expense after expense. So instead of having an aligned policy like you're saying, take it over, give me some rent for it, but you take. They
might even do some of the repairs as well.
Exactly. And then I'm happy to pay that over a period of time. But right now we're in a confrontational relationship with the council because all they do is charge us, and all that happens is it becomes emptier for longer. It's crazy.
Well, yeah, I get that, and it's a helpful addition, really, to the bigger picture. But what if the council? I mean, you're not going to like this, but I might. What if the council made it so difficult for you to sustain your ownership of that property that you were left with little choice but to sell it? That would be a win for the greater good as well, wouldn't it?
Well, I can't because currently with it being in disrepairs, I
Well,
can't sell it.
what sort of estate is it? What sort of a landlord are you, Jonty? Just how run down is this property?
Like a lot of landlords, James, not rich like you say they are, and struggling.
I never say that. All landlords say, don't get your violin out with me. I never say all landlords are rich.
Like, you got landlords who have 1,000 properties.
Yes.
They're doing well, but there are a lot of people with 1, 2, 3.
But how has it ended
properties.
up so run down? That's what I want to know.
Well, a combination of rents haven't gone up with inflation.
Right.
Like in the south, they have. So rents have been very strong. They're not strong in places up north. So rents haven't kept up pace with inflation, and mortgages recently have gone through the roof. So
yes, and also you've got $6,000 worth of.
Listen to what I'm saying.
I am. But you're not answering the question I asked.
No, but another issue, for example, the government's brought in taxation policies where you can't set off the mortgage costs. Have you ever come across a business that's taxed on sales, not taxed on profits? That's essentially what landlords are. It's
well, no, it's not, because your asset is increasing in value all the time. So it's
not up north. It increases.
Well, then you're, with respect, then you're a rubbish landlord.
No.
Yes.
I just picked
the place is run down, and you can't afford to financially sustain
so
it.
I'm a rubbish landlord, but the point is, you want properties that are available.
Yes.
And
but we both like this idea. We both like this idea.
Can I get a word in edgeways?
No.
Or are you going to talk over me?
I think we've heard enough. Have a great day. Dan's in Sutton. Dan, what would you like to say?
Hello. Good morning to you, James.
Hello, Dan.
This really incenses me.
What does?
The fact that there are thousands of empty properties and probably millions across the country.
Yes. Hundreds of thousands, probably.
Yes. Well, yeah. I don't know. I haven't done my research. I've just called up in research. But people need homes. Okay? And whether they're from other countries or not, I don't care. But if there's thousands of properties laying empty, why doesn't the government or the local council compulsorily purchase it, maybe they can do that for 10 or 15 years?
That's too far. That's too far.
It? Not in my opinion, it ain't.
No, I know. But
if you're not going to do anything with it and it's just going to decay.
As Jonty unwittingly demonstrated, if you're not going to do anything with it and you can't afford to make a profit on it, then it is just going to decay and get worse and worse and worse and worse. So you're like me. I haven't found the words yet. There's a sort of visceral sense of absurdity stroke injustice here. 30,000 empty properties in a city that's enduring a massive housing crisis. And it doesn't seem beyond the wit of man to marry the two statistics together and improve the overall situation, does it?
Absolutely. I quite agree with that statement.
I thought you might. I do too. I don't know if I like compulsory purchase, though.
Well, all right, make it temporary then.
So, that is what they're going to do. So they would say, you find someone to live in it or we will.
Right. So, and then if it goes, let's say, for example, to a housing association. Now, I know their books might say they've got millions, but they don't want to let go of it.
Sure.
Same with some landlords. And I don't mean that in a vicious way. But come on. You know, I've got a story I can tell you which actually broke my heart.
Go on.
Okay. I used to be a fire safety officer.
Oh, yeah.
And I was inspecting a property. It was above a pile of shops. With a shop at the bottom and a pile of flats above.
Yeah.
And I knocked on this door because I had to check on their safety measures.
Sure.
Have they got all this, that, and the other? Because I just want to be safe. That's my job. Or was my job. And I knocked on this door, and a young lady called from behind the door, "You can't come in yet, you have to wait."
Okay.
Okay, that's fine. It's all right. I've still got to do what I've got to do.
Building up the suspense here, Dan. I like it. Carry on.
Okay, so the lady that came to the door...
Yeah.
She'd taken a moment to cover herself up,
right,
and fully covered from head to foot.
Yeah,
and there were a couple of 3 kids in that little flat.
Right,
and it was appalling.
The state of the flat.
Yeah. And when I was speaking to this lady, and her English was perfectly good.
Sure.
And it was very clear that she was a highly intelligent, articulate lady.
Right.
That had been put in an absolute rat hole.
Oh, I see.
And this lady, I'm sure, absolutely sure, would be able to contribute beautifully She might have been in the medical profession. I can't recall.
Right.
Maybe dentistry. I'm not sure. I can't recall. But she was obviously not a scrounger, not a taker. But she was put in a situation where she couldn't go out and work. Maybe it was a visa thing. Maybe it was because
I know if she's a bona fide asylum seeker, she's not allowed to go out and work. What does this? So you're saying that property was uninhabitable, and she should have been in one of the 30,000 habitable properties that are all over town.
But I've heard it said I've been sitting on the phone that people don't want to improve their properties. Let's compulsorily purchase them, or for a certain period of time.
I'm frightened of the phrase compulsory purchase. You can't purchase something for a certain period of time. That's renting it.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe.
So compulsory renting. If you don't find someone to live in that place, we will. That's it. That's the ultimatum.
Yeah, that's
I can't see the problem with it. I mean, even old Johnson, who got his knickers in a right old twist, was in favour of it. But who's going to be against it? Just some billionaire who's not going to be listening to this. They're living in Dubai or something like that. They own a tower block in Battersea and they don't need to put people in it. And how dare you suggest that I should interfere? You should be able to interfere with my flat. But I do balk at the phrase compulsory purchase. I'm getting a lot of messages telling me that whatever is meant by up north is that rents have gone up by a lot. Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh have increased by up to 40%. Huge stress for my daughter when she was at university in Glasgow. It's been widely reported that securing student accommodation is almost impossible. All sorts of... But, I mean, up north is a very broad church, isn't it? So I'm sure there are some areas where rents haven't gone up. 11:30 is the time. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines. PMQs is on the way. Is Ben going to be able to join us today? Good. That's a relief. Because he's sitting in for Ian Dale, I think, in the evenings, isn't he? So he's got a busy old day as Ben Kent. So have I, actually. Think it's all... Yeah, exactly. You think we should get the tiny violin out for our landlords? What about radio presenters who are used to clocking off at lunchtime, but today have a gig at the podcast show and then a gig at the South Bank tonight with the Mayor of London? It's flipping heck, no rest for the wicked. I've got a book to write as well, but I don't like to mention that. Talking about the possibility of not compulsory purchases, although feel free to run with that. I mean, maybe there's a strong case for that as well. But the idea that there are 30,000 empty properties in London worth £20 billion and that a lot of the people who own them are so rich that they don't even need people in them. Therefore, they should be robustly encouraged to put people in them, either by putting it on the market, by making continued ownership unsustainable. I don't know how you do that for someone who's truly minted, or by compelling them to rent it out. Otherwise, the local council will do so on their behalf. Betty's in Hillingdon. Betty, what would you like to say?
Every time you keep saying 30,000, it's making my heart just want to just jump out my chest. I'm really, really annoyed because I was speaking to your researcher and producer. Sorry,
that's all right.
I asked her, how many of those properties are in Hillingdon? Because I'm a foster carer in Hillingdon, and she told me. She told me.
Well, don't spoil it. Don't spoil. Let me guess. Is it 388?
I think I'm just under. Was 288, or maybe I misheard.
No, I think it's three. Hang on, let me consult my. 388 is the answer to your question.
Even worse.
I know.
Oh my goodness, that's even worse. That's
388. Average price, off the top of my head, £475,000.
See what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is the thing. I was telling your producer about being a foster carer. It's not easy.
Of course.
But then, being in social housing as well, I've actually asked to be moved so I can house more children because the shortage of foster carers and the poor retention that each borough actually has is crazy. I can't even tell you what the number is. I think last time I saw it was like 4,000 to 10,000 children. So imagine 10,000 children coming into the foster care system, and then you've only got 4,000 foster carers, and you can't even retain them. You can't keep them.
So if you had a bigger home, you would have more children living with you?
Yeah, I've had to crowdfund. I'm crowdfunding at the moment. It's not going very well. However, you still got to try, because going to Hillingdon Council to say, hey, could you rehouse me? They told me, well, if you want to go on the transfer list, you have to give us 10 years of bank statements, 10 years of work experience, 10 years of this, 10 years of that. But because you're a foster carer for Hillingdon, we will make an exception, but you still need to give us these details.
Yeah, well, I mean, that I don't know that would necessarily improve, even if this idea came in.
It doesn't even improve anyway. But then when you're telling me that there's 384 properties...
88, come on.
88, sorry.
Thank you. Honestly, Betty, what's the point of me doing all this incredibly complicated research?
My head. Honestly, right. I'm so angry.
388 properties in Hillingdon alone. Guess how many there are in Hounslow, on my manor?
How many?
1,384.
Do you know what I mean? It's shame. Shame on you, landlords, honestly, because there are
they're not all. I mean, there'll be all sorts of people. I mean, there is a mystery here as well for people like you and I who just don't understand how it happens. It's like me walking past that pub 10 years ago and thinking, how can you have a pub in the middle of the most expensive real estate in central London that is just standing there empty for years, not for weeks or months?
Suspect, isn't it?
It's just baffling. It really is.
It just doesn't all make sense.
So go Westminster Council, go Sadiq Khan. Let's see if we can actually make this work in some way. Broad support for it so far, broad consensus of support. And Betty bringing a new perspective as well. Thank you. 11:38 is the time. Jeff's in Maidstone. Jeff, what do you reckon?
Yeah, hi, good morning.
Hello, Jeff.
All right, mate, yeah. I've got an empty property. I've had it now for quite a long time. A friend was living in it, and he died about 3 years ago after being in it for about 11. Yes, it is sad. Yeah. After, several years he was in it. And since then it stayed empty. A couple of people I know have been wanting to take it over. It's a very old-fashioned terraced house.
Okay.
I'll point that out. But what I'm told is if I put somebody in there and it's not up to the right sort of speculations, apparently it has to be, I can get myself in lots of trouble as far as if they get in there and they decide not to pay the rent, they can refuse to pay the rent and I can have lots of trouble getting them out.
Right.
So I can't, at the moment, I've got in contact with the councils or some of the councils nearby, and apparently there's no grants available. I'm an old age pension. I'm on £152 a week, to live on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could sell the place, but it's memories. I've had a long time.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, crikey, that's a fairly complicated situation in which to find. Because I mean, my initial reaction when you say you're on £152 a week is to have some sympathy for you. But you've decided, and you put me, flipping out, Jeff.
I'm not playing the violin, Joe.
No, I know you're not playing the violin, but you put me in a right old pickle here, haven't you? Because I now have to point out to you that your memories are more important to you or more valuable to you than money. And that's your choice.
Yeah, but of course
I'd sell it tomorrow.
Pay twice as much council tax.
I'd sell it tomorrow.
The council tax.
Yeah, but what I mean, why? Oh, I don't know what to say, because I mean everybody listening is going to struggle to understand why you don't just sell it.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
What sort of memories have you got? Yeah, there's not a body under the patio or something like that, is there, Jeff?
I hope not.
So do I, mate. So what sort of memories are we talking about, if you don't mind me asking? Was it your childhood home?
Yeah, I've had it over 20 years, It's something that I bought when I was in a situation.
Okay, fair enough.
I live in a caravan myself, so, yeah, I know it's a joke, but...
It's not a joke, it's just a curious congregation of circumstances. So you can't move in yourself and do it up, or you don't want to move in yourself and do it up?
I don't really want to move into it, to be honest. I'm quite reasonably happy where I am at the moment.
Fair enough. So if the council came along and said, we'll do it up, and we'll take care of it. We'll guarantee you a rent, because social housing companies do this. They'll guarantee you a rent, even if the people in it stop paying it. Your contract is not with them, it's with the social housing organisation. So we'll make it habitable, and we'll guarantee you an income. Sign here. What would you say?
I'd look into that. I certainly would look into that.
You should do, mate. Seriously.
Yeah. So that can happen. That can still happen, can it? That can be done.
I mean, I'm going back 15 years or something, but I don't think they have changed. I really don't. No, I mean,
I'll try and find out.
Yeah, have a look into it. Just try and find out a local social housing outfit and ask them what the situation is with regard to you putting your property in their hands in return for an income.
Can I just have one more? Of course, I would look into that, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then I've got no say who goes in it, have I? Not that it matters to me a great deal.
No, you haven't. That's all on them. But that, in a way, you should see that as a weight off your shoulders, because the income, the rent is then guaranteed, and they are also responsible for wear and tear. I should stop now. I'm sounding like the property expert on LBC, but I'm not a property expert. I just know that worked for us years and years and years ago. So it's worth looking into, Jeff.
Okay, I'll look into it.
But also, it's turned into a property advice program. Also, I really would just flog it if I were you.
Okay, mate.
Just flog it and go on a cruise. Get a bigger caravan.
Yeah, there you go.
Get a bigger caravan.
Mate.
What do you want to do? Look after yourself, Jeff. All right.
There you go. Cheers. Thanks.
Right, there you go. 11:42. I'm not giving out any more advice. All right. I don't know how that. Bless him. Saber's in Harrow. Saber, what would you like to say?
Yeah, James, it's the tragedy, of course, is this, that we've got lost 1 million houses through right to buy. We've not had them replaced. We've got temporary accommodation. We've got people living in hotels, bed and breakfast.
Yes.
And now, this is not surprising when we're talking about empty homes across London. I work as a chartered surveyor. I used to teach housing finance at South Bank, Middlesex, and at Westminster.
Yes.
So I've got my sort of experience in this particular area. The empty homes that I'm visiting as a surveyor are in prime locations, places like Camden and Warren Street, and places like that. You're talking about 4-story mansions. Now, it's slightly more complicated from that because these are housing associations with empty properties.
How does that happen?
Well, this happens simply because of two things. One is poor management.
Right, okay.
Secondly, not having their, that you're talking about space finders.
Yeah.
They haven't got a space finder equivalent.
Space finders. You have to go do-do-do-do after you say space finders.
Do-do-do-do-do.
Carry on.
And then the other one is the fact that there's a decent home standards which have been introduced to across the board. Now, housing associations have had it good for the last sort of 40 years or so when they had private finance. Well, they used to get 75% housing association grants at one point.
Okay.
Local authorities had none. They were the ones who were going to be providing all the houses. Now, what happened was that now with their stock, they've increased their stock, but their stock has become poorer and poorer.
Right.
There's also been demographic changes. Some of these houses are being housed with people with supported housing needs.
Yes.
Now, as society's changed, that sort of housing is no longer required, so it becomes empty and void.
So it's the difference between assets and expenditure. The assets might look huge, but they can't actually afford to do these properties up to where they...
Some of them, James, have been empty for about 20 years. I'm talking about prime London.
Well, that's space finders, do, mate. That's what we're here for. Just call space for do.
I think it's a brilliant idea, and I think it's necessary. And I think that there has to be a strategic.
We'd pay for ourselves. We'd pay for ourselves in a minute, wouldn't we? The driving around, finding places, tracking down who owns them, going in for a chat.
Well, I think it's about the local authorities. You're right. The local authorities have a strategic role. They used to call enablers. So the strategic role of a local authority, the enabling role, to strategize housing policy within that particular borough. So they need to be able to take the lead to say to the housing associations that are operating in their areas that if you want to get funding from us, you're going to have to play the ball. Empty properties, I want to have a report on empty properties.
Yes, exactly.
By the week,
on my desk by Tuesday.
And what you're doing about it.
I'm with you. I'll put you in charge.
Otherwise, we're going to get James O'Brien there with his
space finders. Yes, exactly that. You can be Robin to my Batman saber. We'll have it covered.
I'll be delighted to do that. But
it's not. I know, but it's a serious point. I mean, it is not. It doesn't.
It's a tragedy.
And I'm glad you've brought social housing into it because that that excuses us, frees us from the stereotypical view of the greedy landlord who can't be. But there are a ton of reasons why these properties are standing empty.
These social housing landlords have actually got billions of assets.
But they're not allowed to sell them.
They're not allowed to sell them, but they've got 40,000, 30,000 houses.
Well, I'd change that. You can sell a few, depending on the market, sell some of them to make sure that the rest of them that are currently empty can be brought up to Sabre. Lovely stuff, mate. It's a win-win-win-win-win situation, this so far, but there are a few minutes left for someone to come along and rain on our parade. 11:46 is the time. 11:49 is the time, and the very straightforward. The problem is politics, eh? Someone comes up with an idea that looks really good and you say, that looks like a really good idea, let's do it. And then automatically, it just gets complicated. It's nowhere near as straightforward as it initially looks. I fully appreciate that. Gabriella takes up the point from I think, an architect's point of view, that the number of homes currently in a habitable condition that would be suitable for vulnerable people, we're not only talking about vulnerable people, but the point stands, will be much smaller than the overall figures. And to unlock these empty properties would take capital. Where will this capital come from? Surely it might be better to spend that capital on buying and creating social homes, i.e. homes that are suitable. I don't know. I mean, yeah, possibly, because then you'd own it rather than leaving it in the hands of the landlord and paying for the upkeep. But I mean, no one's suggesting this is going to solve all of the problems, just that it speaks, I think, the second caller really picked up on this, it speaks to a fundamental sense of injustice, natural injustice. 30,000 empty homes in a city with a housing crisis. God knows how many empty homes in a country with a housing crisis. Helen's in Manchester. Helen, what would you like to say?
I'm here to tell you about an empty home near me.
Gosh, go on.
Where I live, it's a mixture of private and social housing flats. When I first moved in, my next door neighbour was a lovely little old man who, unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years after I moved in.
Okay.
This was just before the lockdowns and the pandemic.
Yeah.
So just before the lockdowns and the pandemic, they cleared out, they gutted the flat because he'd lived there for years. They completely redid it, repainted it, and they, I'm going to say, moved in inverted commas, a new tenant.
Right.
And that new tenant I've only met once. He's never moved in any furniture. He actually told me that his job means that he works away a lot. But like I said, we're kind of 3 years in now, and I've never seen him since. Right. I have had to deal with the gas people knocking on the door because he's not paying the standing charge, and the electric people knocking on the door.
Who owns it?
But it's owned. Am I allowed to name the organisation?
No, don't name the organisation. Tell me what sort of organisation they are.
I would love to name and shame them, but they are a social housing company.
So they've just not got. They're just not doing a very good job. He's having a laugh.
He's having a laugh.
When did you last see him?
I've only seen him once. Like I say, that was 2020.
So it's just been there, empty for 3 years?
It's there, it's empty.
And what happens when you tell the housing association?
And they say as long as he's paying the rent.
Oh, so he is paying the rent?
They don't really care.
What's he using it for? Is it a cannabis farm? What's going on?
No, it's just, honestly, it's a ground floor flat. It's completely, there's no curtains up. So
but why is he paying the rent on it then?
I have no. He told me that the one time I met him, the two things he told me were that A, he spends a lot of time working away for work.
Right.
So I don't know if he's got digs through work.
Right.
And that also he sort of lived with his girlfriend.
Well, maybe. So how does housing benefit work these days? Could it be paid for with money?
I have no idea. I own my flat privately.
But I don't know that this would be on our list.
The definite impression I get is that the social housing company, as long as somebody's paying the rent, they don't care whether that person really needs that property. The thing that really disgusts me is literally on the other side of me, so next door but one to the empty flat, I've got a lovely neighbour, lovely old lady. She was in the British Forces for years. She's currently renting privately. Her private landlord has put up her rent by over £100 in the last 12 months. She's really struggling to afford it.
Bless her.
And she can't get into a social housing flat.
And this bloke's clogging it up.
Identical to hers, next door but one, that she knows has sat empty for 3 years, and they're saying, no, we've not got any housing for you, love, sorry.
I mean, two thoughts. The first is, this is obviously ridiculous. But the second is, I don't know that Space Finders could help you.
No.
Because it's not, I mean, it is rented out. It's not it's standing empty, but not standing empty, if you see what I mean.
For me, social housing is supposed to be for the people who need it.
No one's arguing about that. You're absolutely, of course you're right. No, I know.
If he doesn't need it, it boils up. You're just allowed to throw money at the situation.
Is it a massive social housing organisation?
It's huge, and it's just been taken over by an even bigger one.
There it is, because the bigger it is, I suspect, the more likely it is that these sort of situations can transpire. And you know, whose job is it to make sure that is in? It's no one. We haven't got anyone on the staff whose job it is to make sure that a property that is being rented out and the rent is being paid is actually inhabited. I mean, I don't know how common that particular experience would be. I know that you used to be able to get your rent paid if you were signing on. Housing benefit would go direct from the council to the landlord. I thought that had changed. I thought, for example, universal credit and things like that meant that there was often a shortfall, but I don't know. I mean, crikey, what a mess, albeit one that I don't think Space Finders could fix. Is it Johan or Johan?
Johan.
Johan's in Braintree. Johan, what would you like to say?
Good afternoon. Small-time landlord in Essex.
Yeah.
Been doing it for about 15, 20 years. The best solution with that sort of problem would be, like house a couple of doors away from me. It's been empty for 5 years. The council get council tax every month.
Yeah.
They get in touch with the owner and say, look, we've got this house, has been rented out, has been used. we give you 3 months to sort yourself out, or we will give it to somebody.
Yeah.
Somebody like me, who's known to the local council as a good landlord.
Why are we giving it to you?
No, not me. To anybody who's a good landlord.
Right.
Give it to them on a 5 or 6 year lease. Whatever it takes to repair, they can pay that. That will be deducted from the rent for first year or 18 months.
Yeah.
After that, I will look after the property for 25-30% out of that rent. And
I'll give you 20
for the rest of the lease.
I'll give you 20.
Say 20%. Yes.
Yeah. There you go. That was easy.
Everybody's happy.
I'm good at this.
The council could recommend a good landlord.
You have a list of approved landlords, so you wouldn't even need to do it in-house. A little bit of public-private partnership.
That's right.
I
And
like
we
this.
look after the house.
Yeah.
We get it. We get the boiler sorted. We get the electrician sorted. Everything goes wrong, we get it sorted. And every 5 years, they look at that again and say, look, we want to carry on with this. We're happy. My mum's house has been looked after, blah, blah, blah.
Blah, blah, blah.
And, and everybody makes something out of it, and somebody gets a nice house out of it. Rather than, I know somebody who's been sitting on a bungalow, or on a property for 13, 14 years.
Is it a bungalow?
A bungalow, yeah.
I thought so.
And it's no use to anybody. I know another family who are DIY people.
Yeah.
Their parents passed away 18 months ago.
Right.
They couldn't be bothered to clean the place up and put it on a market. They just sold it for £75,000 less
than they would have got if they'd done it up. I love your sense of outrage at that 75 grand that they've... Why? What do you mean by DIY people?
Well, I mean, somebody who can put a door up, somebody put a...
Oh, I see. So they just couldn't be bothered.
Couldn't be bothered. And you know what? All went to school with me, all the family.
Right.
I know they can do these things. They used to fix their cars and make them...
Going off piece a bit now, Johan. We're going off piece a bit. I mean, to be fair, they don't have to do it. If they just want to sell it and take the money, they can. I mean, it's not... They don't have to do it. Maybe they didn't want to do all the DIY work. Some people hate it.
Exactly. It's been sitting there 18 months.
Yeah, but they've sold it now.
Right. Yeah, they sold it now, but what I'm saying...
Forget about that house. Focus on the bungalow.
Yeah, the bungalow.
Yes.
They don't want to sell it.
I
they
know.
want to sit on it.
It's just outrageously empty all the time.
Exactly.
Well,
and that house could be turned into a palace.
Do you know what they should do? They should get you round and give you 20%, and then you'd sort everything out.
Exactly. That's what this is what business is all about.
I think you make some brilliant points. And actually, that combination, if you like, of public and private. So Johan essentially becomes a mini social housing organisation in that he doesn't own the property, but he is like the property manager in return for a consideration. Good Lord, do you know that the switchboard is still full? Producer didn't think this was a very good idea for a conversation, but I did. I thought it was an absolute killer. And I was right again. It's 11:58. Should we take some more calls on this after 12:30? I think we shall. Not you, the other producer. Ben Kentish is here to talk us through PMQs. Well, this is an interesting morning, Ben.
It is indeed, James. No shortage of potential options for Keir Starmer today, is there? I would be absolutely staggered if there wasn't some mention of Suella Braverman. But I don't think Keir Starmer will want to dwell on it entirely because there's so much else around. Food prices up 19%, inflation dropping slightly, but still almost 9%. There's the row about immigration rumbling on. We've had
numbers tomorrow.
Numbers tomorrow. A lot of what you've been talking about housing and the lack of it in this country. So lots of options for Keir Starmer.
Why food inflation is so high? Because overall inflation is coming down. It's still, I think, for people and me, you hear that inflation is coming down, and somehow you think until you screw your head back on, you think that prices must be coming down, but of course inflation is still massive.
Yeah. It's still,
but it's
food
double on food what it is on everything else, which is confusing.
Yep.
It's 19%.
19%, almost record highs, James, and you're absolutely right. All that it means when inflation drops is that the rate at which prices are increasing has slowed down. They're still going up prices in the last quarter by almost 9%. Now, yes, in previous quarters they were going up by more than 10%, but they're not coming down. And all it means is people are still going to feel the pinch more and more and more, even at a slightly slower rate perhaps than they were 6 to 9 months ago. And I think that's why Keir Starmer won't want to look like he's just focusing all his attention on what is... It matters, of course it matters, standards and the impartiality of the civil service, but he will want to make sure that he is linking that to the issues, the bigger issues, let's be honest, that are affecting people. Does he do that by claiming the government's engulfed in unity and infighting when it should be focusing on the priorities? Is that the sort of language we'll hear? I mean, there's no shortage of quotes from outraged or certainly very frustrated backbench Tory MPs, all of them, of course, anonymous, James, in the newspapers this morning. One of them calling on Rishi Sunak to grow some balls when it comes to his handling of some of this.
Are you allowed to say that on the radio?
I think I can say that.
Hang on a minute, that's a little bit ripe.
I think I can say that.
Really? Fair enough. You have now.
Let's consult Ellen.
No, of course you could. Is he allowed to say that? Is he? Yes, apparently you are. This is the part of the week where we cross live somewhat abruptly to the House of Commons when Keir Starmer gets to his feet. You've done it again, haven't you? You've offered up all manner of suggestions. So what would be your absolute stone-cold guarantee?
Would be Keir Starmer quoting some of the Tory MP backbench critic quotes back at Rishi Sunak about bravery and asking why, when it comes to Suella Braverman, he didn't ask his independent investigator.
4 days.
Yeah, it took him 4 days, and he didn't ask Sir Laurie Magnus to open an inquiry. He sort of consulted them when he needed to. Keir Starmer might say, what's the point of having this bloke if Rishi Sunak himself is going to do the inquiry without handing it over?
Is it getting, because I read some of these contributions, as you remind us, all of them are anonymous, but all of them are also pretty crackers. Are we looking at factionalism now on a almost Corbyn-esque scale in the Tory party, and the sort of circular firing squad, they're spending more time arguing with each other than they are with the opposition?
It's almost the opposite in a sense, James, because actually the rump of Tory MPs that are furious with Rishi Sunak is still a relatively small minority, whereas with Corbyn, of course, it was almost the entire parliamentary party.
The ones that resisted the Windsor framework, so you count them in their 20s,
small.
really.
They're small but vocal. Do they have the potential to topple Rishi Sunak?
Hang on a minute, here we go, Keir Starmer on his feet.
How many work visas were issued to foreign nationals last year?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the new statistics, as the honourable gentleman knows, will be out later this week. The most recent statistics we had, as the ONS said at the time, contained a set of unique circumstances, including welcoming many people here for humanitarian reasons.
They're not work visas. The figures are out. It's 250,000 work visas were issued last year. He knows that answer. He just doesn't want to give it. And the new numbers tomorrow are expected to be even higher. The Prime Minister stood on 3 Tory manifestos, each one promised to reduce immigration. Each promise broken. They all stood on those manifestos as well. Why does he think his Home Secretary...
Order. I'm going to hear this question. Those who don't want to hear it, we know the answer. Keir Starmer.
They all stood on those manifestos. So why does he think his Home Secretary seems to have such a problem coping with points-based systems?
Well, Mr. Speaker...
And the same respect will be shown, Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, just this week we announced the biggest ever single measure to tackle legal migration, removing the right for international students to bring dependents, toughening the rules on post-study work and reviewing maintenance requirements. But what is the honourable gentleman's contribution? There are absolutely no ideas. There is absolutely no ideas, absolutely no semblance that there would be any control. Why? Because he believes in an open-door migration policy.
Mr. Speaker, if anyone wants to see what uncontrolled immigration looks like, all they've got to do is wake up tomorrow morning, listen to the headlines and see what this government...
Order. Mr. Bristow, I think you're going to be leaving. I'm asking you to leave now, because otherwise I'll name you. I'm not having it, and I've warned you before. It's the same people. And the same will happen on this side. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the reason they're issuing so many visas is labour and skills shortages. And the reasons there are shortages is the low-wage Tory economy. Under his government's rules, businesses in IT, engineering, healthcare, architecture, welding can pay foreign workers 20% less than British workers for years and years on end. Does he think his policy is encouraging businesses to train people here or hire from abroad?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about immigration, but we know his position because it turns out that Labour would actually like to see even more people coming to the UK, increasing the numbers. That's not just my view, Mr. Speaker. Those were the words of his own frontbencher who said having a target isn't sensible, and that the numbers might have to go up, Mr. Speaker. So it's clear, whilst we're getting on with clamping down on legal migration, listening to the British public, he's perfectly comfortable wanting to say that he wants free movement back.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, they've lost control of the economy, they've lost control of public services, and now they've lost control of immigration. And if he was serious about weaning his government off the immigration lever, he would get serious about wages in Britain and get serious about skills and training. The apprenticeship levy isn't working. It's hard to find a single business that thinks that it is. And the proof is that almost half the levy isn't even being spent. That's fewer young people getting the opportunities they need to fulfil their potential. Businesses are crying out for more flexibility in the levy so they can train up their staff. Labour would give them that. Why won't he?
Mr. Speaker, it's right that we're talking about education and skills. What he failed to mention is just in the past week, what did we discover? Thanks to the reforms of the Conservative government, our young people are now the best readers in the Western world, Mr. Speaker. Reforms that were opposed by the party opposite. He also talked about our record on the economy. And I am very surprised, Mr. Speaker, because I've stood here week after week when he's been so keen to quote the IMF, Mr. Speaker. And he seemed to have missed their press conference yesterday, where they actually raised our growth forecast by one of the highest they've ever done, said that we've acted decisively to make sure that the economy is growing, and credited this government with having a very positive effect on future growth.
Is the Prime Minister seriously suggesting that breaking the economy, breaking public services, losing control of immigration is some sort of carefully crafted plan? His policies are holding working people back, and all he offers is more of the same. But fear not, because speeding into the void left by the Prime Minister comes the Home Secretary. Not with a plan for skills, growth or wages, no. Her big idea is for British workers to become fruit pickers. Just in case, I can hardly believe she said this, that they forget how to do things. Does the Prime Minister support this let them pick fruit ambition for Britain? Or does he wish he had the strength to give her a career change of her own?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about public service, he talks about the economy. Again, I think he's just failed to notice what's going on. The IMF, as they've said, it's right here, Mr. Speaker. Our forecasts, which he was very keen to point out just a few months ago, now their forecasts are that we will have stronger growth than Germany, France and Italy, Mr. Speaker. What do they say? They're saying that we are prioritising what's right for the British people, Mr. Speaker. He talked about public services, I said. Best reading results in the Western world. When it comes to the NHS, what did we just discover last week? Ambulance waiting times at the fastest response in 2 years, Mr. Speaker. That's a Conservative government delivering for the British people.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary may need a speed awareness course. He needs a reality check. This mess on immigration reveals a Tory party with no ambition for working people and no ambition for Britain. Just the same old failed ideas, low wages and high tax. Labour would fix the apprenticeship levy, fill the skills gap and stop businesses from recruiting from abroad if they don't pay properly. That's because we're the party of working people. What does it say about him and his party that they won't do the same?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think he said it 6 times, but I don't think we actually know how he's going to do any of these things, Mr. Speaker. And look, that's the difference between us, Mr. Speaker, because every week we hear a lot of empty rhetoric from the honourable gentleman opposite, but in the past we can measure ourselves by actions. What have we done on this side of the House? We've introduced new powers to curb disruptive protests. We're protecting public services against undisruptive strike action, Mr. Speaker, and we have new laws to stop the boats. What has he done? He's voted against every single one of those. And that's the difference between us. While he's working on the politics, we're working for the British people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have all witnessed how Putin is carrying out his savage war against Ukraine. He commenced it, he is the aggressor, and he cannot be allowed to win. That war is now at a pivotal point. So will the Prime Minister use his friendship with President Zelensky to ensure whatever military equipment they need, they will get, be that missiles, drones or jets?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was an honour to welcome my friend President Zelensky to the UK last week. I think everyone will be collectively proud of the UK's leading role at the forefront of supporting Ukraine. We were the first country to provide support for Ukrainian troops, first country to provide lethal weapons in Europe, the first to commit main battle tanks, and most recently the first to provide long-range weapons. He will have seen the powerful scenes coming out of the G7 summit in Hiroshima last week, and I've always been clear that we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we learned today that the price of milk, cheese and eggs are up 29%. The price of pasta is up 27%. The price of a loaf of bread, 18%. Does the Prime Minister agree that this is no longer just a cost of living crisis? This is a cost of greed crisis.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was welcome that inflation has fallen today, but as the Chancellor said, we should not be complacent because there is more work to do. The Honourable Gentleman's right to highlight the impact of food inflation, which is too high, common here in levels that we've seen in other European countries like Sweden and Germany. We are providing significant support to help people with the cost of living, and the Chancellor has met with companies in the supermarket and food supply chain to make sure that they are doing everything they can to bring prices down.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, let's get real, because the food inflation remains at a near 45-year high. Now, yesterday the Treasury indicated that the Chancellor stands ready to act, but his actions seem to be predicated on the outcome of a review by the Consumer and Market Authority. So can the Prime Minister perhaps enlighten us? When does he expect that review to conclude? Because working families can't afford to wait much longer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, honourable gentlemen will know that the CMA is independent of government, but the Chancellor did meet with them recently to discuss the situation in the grocery industry, and it will be for the CMA to make decisions on that. But we're doing everything we can to help consumers manage the challenges of the cost of living, Mr. Speaker. But if the SNP wanted to do their bit, maybe that they could reconsider their deposit return scheme, which has been, it's very clear what people have said. It will. It says, as people have said, it will reduce choice and increase prices for consumers.
Andrew Samuel.
The Primary Care Access Plan published this month is a very welcome and substantive one, and my constituents want to see rapid delivery of it. So how quickly will the government start providing the £645 million to pharmacists?
13 minutes after 12 is the time. It was a fairly swift one. We've got a minute. We'll pick over the bones of what has just unfolded shortly, but let's just, it's quite rare to chuck someone out of the chamber, Ben Kentish.
Yes, Paul Bristow, James.
What do we know about Paul Bristow?
A huge, I'm not talking about his physicality. He's a huge supporter of Boris Johnson, I was going to say.
He's one of those.
Real backer, Boris Johnson.
Right.
Very much one of the ultra-loyal rump of hardcore Johnsonites in the Conservative Party, but was being too loud for Lindsay Hoyle's liking, sitting very close to the Speaker, and not for long, because I think second question in, he was out.
And he's off. I can't remember the last time that happened in PMQs.
Going back months, probably
only
years.
months?
I can't remember the last time.
No. Well, maybe it was the proximity to the Speaker that was the problem, because he didn't seem, from the pictures, to be behaving any more obnoxiously than Jonathan Gullis does every week. But if you're going to behave like that, then don't sit too near to
He's
the
one
Speaker.
of the, I think, repeat offenders in the eyes of
He's always
Lindsay Hoyle. Likes to heckle.
Likes a bellow. Well, what does he do now? Just sort of kicks his heels in
he just walks out.
Goes for an early lunch,
has
an
a
early
nice
bath
lunch by himself.
Sits on his own,
consoles himself in the dressing room, and then comes
no
back
lasting penalties, no lasting punishments. At least, anyway, you live and learn. It's 12:15. 17 minutes after 12. Ben Kentish, LBC's Westminster editor, stroke presenter, stroke Ian Dale deputiser at the moment, is still with me to just have a look at what happened at PMQs. It's a challenge for every political leader, really. And it occurs to me that what they have to do is somehow frame an immigration policy that keeps the racists happy. And Keir Starmer is, I think, for good or for ill, stepping into this space, but also keeps the people who hate the racists happy as well. And it's presumably impossible to do that.
It was quite a smart way of doing it,
yes.
I thought, from Keir Starmer today, which was to link it very specifically to the issue of skills, James. Because if you say to everybody, I think, do you think we should be training up our young people better to fill the gaps in our economy? Very few people are going to say no. And Keir Starmer started off with quite a punchy attack on Rishi Sunak when it came to work visas and the increasing numbers of those that have been issued in recent years. And is explaining, as he put it, that is because of the skill shortages in our economy. We are having to recruit more and more people from overseas to fill those gaps in all sorts of areas. That's care, health, construction, hospitality, the list goes on and on and on. And then he moved on to contrast that with the what he sees and Labour sees as problems with the apprenticeship levy, i.e. the failure to do enough to train people up here to fill those gaps in the first place. So it's a reasonably smart way of doing it for the reason you say. It's not just hammering Rishi Sunak from the right. It's trying to say, look, this is not just about people coming here. It's also about what we do for younger people in this country.
It's clever, but it's a holding pattern. It's a holding tactic because you if you don't train people up, or if there are not people there, I'm often intrigued by who these people are that are sitting there waiting to be doctors or waiting to be trained up to do technical work. And if they don't suddenly appear and sign up for whatever scheme it is that Keir Starmer introduces, then you will continue to bring people in from overseas. And if you're in power when that happens, then the other side will start claiming that. So I guess the failure, the refusal, the cowardice to say we need lots and lots of people from overseas is now absent from British politics.
Yeah, I think nobody wants to admit that. They are admitting it in policy because we are recruiting more and more people from overseas, James. But you're right.
All the economists, all the experts essentially say it's not a bad thing. It is a necessary thing. It's a good thing. The sooner that the British public have a political leadership that explains this to them and stops pandering to the very obviously seductive and intoxicating xenophobia that's been around since before Brexit, then the better for everyone concerned. But Starmer is categorically ducking that challenge.
Well, Starmer's also talking about getting figures down. He is also very much arguing for the same thing as the government, which is we need to get a grip on the number of people coming here. I thought he slightly undermined his own point, James, by his attack on Suella Braverman for suggesting that we need to train people up to pick fruit in this country. Because you can't, on the one hand, say, look, the government is recruiting too many people from overseas to do the jobs that need doing. We need to be training more up here. Some of those jobs are in agriculture. Some of those jobs do include picking fruit. So Keir Starmer, on the one hand, says we need to be training more people to do those jobs. On the other hand, when Suella Braverman says we need people here to do those jobs, he accuses her of saying, let them pick fruit, and suggests the Prime Minister should give her a career change of her own. So I thought you can't have it both ways. You can't talk about British people doing the jobs that need filling, but they will include jobs in agriculture.
But nobody listening wants their children to be trained to be a fruit picker.
Perhaps,
but
they don't. Somebody's got to do it.
Yes, I know.
You either have
but in terms of who's watching PMQs and who's listening to this, he's saying to them, I know you know this, he's saying to them, she thinks your children should be picking fruit. She doesn't think her children should be. She thinks your children, whereas in fact, as you point out, the elephant in the room is that we'd have to bring in, foreign student labour wouldn't be a problem, you know, but that would involve visas, and that is the...
And that's where the government's clamping down, because it's quite an easy way to do it, because, of course, you don't then have the problems of people, farmers or hospitality, business owners, healthcare leaders and so on saying, well, hang on, you just removed all of our staff.
And growth. I mean, immigration remains, by pretty much every account, a key constituent of economic growth, which is, of course, the holy grail for all of them. It didn't deal very well with the IMF question. I love IMF stories. I love the way that I think Rees-Mogg claims that the IMF are biased against the United Kingdom. I've seen various ghouls from Tufton Street claim the same. I mean, they literally can't be. It was the IMF in 1976 that bailed out the Labour government. They're the international lender of last resort. They say things that responsible governments respond to, and then when the next forecast comes around, if the responsible governments have responded responsibly, then the forecast will improve. I mean, it's not exactly rocket science, but it's been turned into such a bizarre political hot potato, and Starmer didn't even go there when Sunak slapped him with that.
He just ignored it, didn't he? I agree. I know what you mean, James. I like the idea that the International Monetary Fund is a sort of bastion of socialism.
Biased against Brexit. They tried to punish us for Brexit. I've read this, not just in the Telegraph, but even in some vaguely sensible organs as well.
What people just conveniently forget, of course, is that it's not. It makes forecasts.
Yes.
Forecast might be right, forecast might be wrong. They're not saying this is nailed on to happen. They're saying, given the current evidence, this is roughly where we think things will be in 6 months, a year's time.
Change course, and it might not.
Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not. Well, policies change, the outcomes change. So yes, it's become a real political football, hasn't it? Clearly a boost for the government that actually it's revised its forecast. Clearly a boost for everybody.
They've been congratulated by the IMF for doing things that the IMF wanted them to do, and therefore the forecasts have been improved accordingly. It is one of the saddest elements of Britain. I'm writing about it at the moment, Ben. You can probably tell that's why I actually sound like I know what I'm talking about for once. But it is utterly, it's the most bovine example of footballification. So they say something that is good for you politically, they're wonderful. They say something that is bad for you politically, they're absolutely awful. Treat them exactly the same. But, what Polonius said, or it's in If, isn't it? It's in that Rudyard Kipling poem, whether they're coming with good stuff or bad stuff. But here we are. Rees-Mogg will be popping up in the next 10 minutes going, you can't trust the IMF as far as you can throw them, which in Jacob Rees-Mogg's case would not be very far. Bonkers. What else did we come up with?
Well, Stephen Flynn. Well, let's touch on Suella Braverman first. Keir Starmer opting not to. It didn't work in my view.
He's shot the fox, hasn't he? Really, he's not doing an investigation, and you can hit him over the head as many times as you want on what grounds this is based on. He's not going to tell you.
And rather than actually sort of asking about it at all directly, really, Keir Starmer just sort of shoehorning in some slightly half-hearted jokes about the Home Secretary speeding into the void. There was quite a good one about linking it to immigration. Why does the Home Secretary have a problem with points-based system? That was decent.
Good joke.
But then it sort of moved on. He said the Home Secretary needs a speed awareness course. Rishi Sunak needs a reality check. He was trying to reference it, but without actually really alluding to it or the substance of it in a way that I wasn't sure worked particularly well. So let's move on to Stephen Flynn, who asked Rishi Sunak, the SNP leader, of course, very directly about that issue that we were talking about, James, the incredible rises in food prices, 19% in the last quarter, near record highs. Was this no longer just a cost of living crisis, he asked the Prime Minister, but also a cost of greed crisis, because of course you've got some of the businesses, energy companies, supermarkets still making pretty hefty profits, record profits in some cases, at the same time as food prices that people are paying hit near record highs. Rishi Sunak obviously talking about the difficulties that he accepts that is causing for people, talking about the fact that it is starting to come down, but skating over the element about how the fact that some people are making a lot of money out of this while others are really struggling to put food on the table.
Yeah. And I mean, I suppose it's a strange one for Starmer not to have gone for as well, or gone for more, because it's free market, isn't it? You charge whatever you can get away with. This is what the Tory government, I mean, Liz Truss took it to its apotheosis and suffered accordingly, but they all sign up for it. It's the Tufton Street ideology writ large. You can't possibly boss companies around. If you boss companies around, the world as we know it would end. Supermarkets ramp up their prices during a period of inflation, and then when inflation starts coming down again, the prices don't come down and everybody sits there scratching their head. What can a government do?
Well, you could have a windfall tax. You could have a windfall
on
tax.
The supermarkets.
You could have a windfall tax on any company that, because of circumstances beyond their control, then they've done it in the oil. And Labour's not calling for this, but I wonder if Keir Starmer at some point might start saying we want.
Doesn't make my pineapples any cheaper, does it? I know you might redistribute the money raised in a windfall.
That's
but
very true.
Can I tell Sainsbury's to stop charging so much?
Your pineapples would stay the same price.
You can't touch my pineapples, Ben Kentish.
Unless you set up a fund slightly similar to how they've done with the oil and gas levy, James, and use sort of subsidised prices. I think politically there's a big difference between calling for a big, hefty levy on the oil giants and on the supermarkets. I think it's harder to do politically. Why did Keir Starmer not mention it? I think they saw an open goal this week, James, on immigration. And we've talked before about how they see this as a tricky issue.
And then it kicks off tomorrow and everyone's got Starmer in the back of their mind.
It's an obvious opportunity for Keir Starmer to try to sort of negate the attacks that the Tories are going to continue to launch on Labour when it comes to immigration. It's an obvious week to point out the fact that, as he did, the Conservatives have gone into what we have 4 general elections now, promising to cut migration, and every single year pretty much.
Cameron said tens of thousands.
That went pretty quickly. We're now on to 500,000 net migration last year, expected tomorrow to be somewhere between 700 and 900,000. So it's going up and up. So I think Keir Starmer's team would have thought, right, this is the moment to do it. But there are 2 arguments in the Labour Party on this. There are those who would advocate that approach, who say, look, it's going to be an issue at the next election. We can't just dismiss it. We've got to try and fight fire with fire. We've got to have an immigration policy of our own. We've got to reassure voters who are worried that we'd be soft on immigration by showing them that we wouldn't, and attacking the government for being too lax. And that's what Keir Starmer was doing today. There are others in his party who say, why on earth are we fighting the Conservatives on their own ground?
Yes.
Let's just stop talking about immigration. It's not something that we are particularly strong on. It's not necessarily a big factor why people are going to vote for us. Let's just let them talk about it.
It's not polling like it used to do. Anything like it used to do, is it?
It went up a lot when they talked about small boats. But no, you're right. It's come to basically the more it's talked about, the more people say it matters to them. So there are those in Labour and there are actually some Tory MPs that say the same, James. Just stop talking about it. If we stop talking about it, it won't be an issue. I was talking to former cabinet the other week who said, why does Rishi Sunak keep going on about small boats? Because all he's doing is highlighting the fact that more and more of them are coming here. And there's that view in quite senior people in the Labour Party too. Stop talking about it. Let the Tories go on about it. Just keep hammering them on the cost of living, on the NHS, on the economy. Starmer's team, those closest to him, don't buy that argument. They think, look, it is going to be an issue. We can't just ignore it. We've got to have something to say. And today was the something to say. We saw what they have to
say. I think we have this every week almost now, whereas as we try to get a handle on Starmer as opposed to Sunak, and he is preempting and second guessing again. So really, it's not what Labour's policy is in this area. It's about defending Labour from accusations from the Tories. So he lied when he said that Starmer was in favour of restoring free movement. I mean, he was once. It's another area in which Starmer has shifted, but he's not. He's simply not in favour of restoring free movement. He's been adamant about that on several occasions. So what Starmer does is essentially build defences before the attack has occurred, and that ends up frustrating people who are behind those defences, who would much rather be out fighting with the attacks. They're saying, no, we don't need to weaponise immigration like this. We don't need to do that. But he is, in his own mind and in the minds of his advisors, he is insulating himself from the kind of attacks that Rishi Sunak made today on 2 fronts, freedom of movement and open door immigration, both demonstrably untrue and yet potentially still effective unless Starmer has got these defences in place.
Yeah, to be really clear, you're absolutely right, James. Keir Starmer, when he campaigned to be Labour leader, said he wanted to bring back freedom of movement. He's since very, very clearly and definitively dropped that pledge. He doesn't want to bring back freedom of movement. Not just that, he said here on LBC, I think last week, he said it repeatedly, that he does want to get immigration numbers down. He refused to put a target on exactly how much he wants to get them down by, but he does want to get them down. That won't stop, of course, Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives pointing out that he only a few years ago promised to bring back freedom of movement and so on. But what the hope is, in his mind, will be that if voters hear that, they will have also have heard him on days like today accusing the Tories of being too soft on immigration, talking about the need to get numbers down, and the attack from Rishi Sunak and his party just won't stick because voters will have heard him say something repeatedly that's quite different.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way around before, because you also have that. They're desperately trying to paint him as dithering, and that works with the continuity Corbyn lot because they liked the stuff that he said before he dithered. But the Tories are essentially saying he's dithered and now he is saying the stuff that we agree with. So it's an odd criticism. Potentially it's an odd criticism. Ben Kentish, thank you very much. You're back. What time are you back on tonight?
7 o'clock tonight.
Good Lord, that's a shift, isn't it? Guys, good job you're young. Speaking of young, Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, will be taking your calls from 1 p.m. on LBC with Sheila Fogarty. If you want to book your place to put a question to him, then make sure you got your finger just hovering over the dial at 1 o'clock today. He'll be in the studio with Sheila. The time now is 12:31 and Amelia Cox is here with your headlines. 12:35 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We've got another... This story we really went for this one. Yeah, I never know, I'm quite good at this job these days, but, always a work in progress. I just think it's fascinating. I think it speaks to something a bit deeper than normal politics. The idea of empty properties existing on an epic scale in a country with a housing crisis. So what are you going to do about it? Fill them up. Who with? Discuss. 12:35 is the time. Peter's in Sutton. Peter, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello, James.
Hello,
lovely to speak to you.
Likewise.
I was just listening, that gentleman was on there and he had a house and he couldn't afford to do it up and he couldn't afford to, do anything. In Ireland, in Cork years ago, there was whole areas of the city were completely run down.
Oh, yeah.
And the government or the council made whole areas of the city tax-free. That meant you could buy a house, invest in it,
right,
refurbish it, do it up, and you paid no tax for 10 years.
When was this?
Back in the 90s, I think, the early 90s.
Was it?
And what happened was, these run-down derelict areas, laneways became alleys, turned into, cafes and this and that. But
how did they make sure? So, but you could only buy it if you were going to live in it. You couldn't say
no. Anyone could invest.
But then, you're just giving bonuses to property developers, aren't you?
Well,
it worked.
The other option, it was like all falling down. But what I'm going to say to you is, if you owned the property, and like that gentleman there, and you couldn't afford to do it up, lots of people inherit a property and have no capital, right?
That's true.
So the council would take the property off you for 7 years. They refurbish it.
Okay.
They turn it into apartments and they rent them out. And you had a contract with the council. After 7 years, they'd give you back the property for nothing, with the tenants in it or without the tenants.
Well, I never. Did you do it yourself? Were you involved in it, or were you just an interested observer?
I just was interested in it because, and now in Ireland as well, housing is a terrible problem. Housing is going to change the government the next time because the rent and the lack of property is unbelievable.
I'm not across my Irish politics like I should be. What happened to all those empty ones that were left after the crash?
I think a lot of them have been finished off and sold off. But the price of property in Ireland now is like London prices, and rent
you've got a booming economy. I think you have got a booming economy without the house building going alongside it. So it's not.
Yeah, but the problem is, it's no good having a booming economy and having good jobs if you're paying €2,500 a month rent and can't buy a house.
No, you're absolutely. I was in Dorky a couple of summers ago. It's like Hampstead, isn't it? You got the prices going off the charts over there. Peter, thank you.
They should come up with some sort of a policy and then use tax to shape the policy they want. You know what I'm saying?
I do. That's why Sadiq Khan is calling for devolution, so that councils could actually do that, whether him or Westminster City Council, who he's in cooperation with on this one. I still think there's a flow chart. Someone needs to write. I might ask him tonight. Need a full account of what you can and can't do. Because I remember for the first year of Sadiq coming into the studio to Speak to Sadiq, I was staggered by how little power he actually had, for such a big job that we all get so excited about. On the policing side of things, he's got quite a bit. But on the things like some of the undevolved powers on things like that, he's got precious little. And he's not got as much on policing as I thought he did have. It's funny because I was obviously living in London when Boris Johnson was Mayor of London, heard him interviewed tons of times, but they never really seemed to talk. They never really touched on how little power there actually was, presumably because he was essentially a symbolic mayor anyway. Thank you, Peter. Margaret's in Soho. Margaret, what would you like to say?
Hello, thanks for taking my call.
You're most welcome.
Welcome
aboard.
I love your show.
Thank you.
Thank you for keeping me. I'm going to add my weight to the army of people who said, thank you for keeping me sane.
It's a lovely thing to say. It's a love. I've got no way of knowing whether you are actually sane or not, Margaret. And some people might think that saying that I have kept you sane is actually a mark of not being sane, a sort of catch-22 type situation. But I'm very grateful anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Also, I'd like, because I'm in Soho, which is Westminster, I'd like to confirm that it is indeed Labour-controlled now.
Yes, I saw.
It has been for the last year, but they've got an uphill battle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've lived around here for nearly 40 years, and, I've squatted and rented and bought and got divorced and flat shared and da. Finally now, for the last 17 years, I'm a housing association tenant.
Okay.
And I'm liking the idea about, handing over empty properties to local authorities and housing associations and the like to actually take control.
Yes. Do you see many empty properties out and about?
Oh, God. I mean, central London, it feels like we're being depopulated.
It's nuts, isn't it? And not necessarily all examples of investors just buying it and leaving it empty. It has been impressed upon me that poor management of various organisations and housing associations may have played a part in this as well.
But sometimes it feels, that residents just aren't wanted in central London.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the same all over in cities everywhere.
No, it's not. I was in Manchester. I was in Manchester last week, and there's a growth in residential in the central parts of Manchester. I used to live. I never lived quite in Soho. I lived just north of Oxford Street back in the day, and it was
Fitzrovia.
Yeah, that's right. It was a residential hub. I mean, it was a busy place. And I was working in a shop.
Soho always has been residential. It's been for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
I've got neighbours whose families have lived here for generations.
Really?
I mean, it's and your boarded up pub.
Yes.
I feel your pain because my kitchen window looks south directly over Leicester Square, and I see the cranes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't mind the cranes, but it's just a weird calculation that someone thinks I'll leave it empty for 15 years and then get a big jackpot a little bit further down the line.
It's a metaphor for a boarded up city, basically.
Yeah. And it's sad.
And don't get me started on Airbnb.
Well, I'm going to ask about that, because what if all of these landlords being compelled to put people in their buildings just signed it up for Airbnb instead? That wouldn't really help solve any of the problems that we're talking about.
Because it's an unlawful change of use, isn't it? It's a residential property is being turned into a de facto hotel.
Yes, that's true. Is that why, now you come to mention it, if I'm wandering up Charing Cross Road and I walk past an entrance to a block, there'll be 10 key safes on the wall outside? Is that because of Airbnbs?
Some of it is, but also, I mean, I know what you're seeking. I know what you're talking about.
Yes.
Some of it, but also there will be elderly people or
who need
disabled people who need whose carers need to come in.
Yes.
So I
never thought of that. God, that's it. Yes, you live and learn. Thank you. I'm very jealous. I loved living in the West End, but it's been a long time. The only downside, I don't know whether you find this, Margaret, but when your friends fall out of nightclubs at 3 o'clock in the morning and they're looking for somewhere to sort of continue partying, my buzzer used to go off like fireworks back in the day. I hope you don't suffer from that experience.
No, just noisy pedicabs and...
Yes, good. The last thing you want is some carousing reveller turning up in the small hours when you're settling down with a mug of Ovaltine and an Agatha Christie. God, it was a nightmare, that. Used to treat it like a stopping off point between clubs on their way from, I don't know, Leicester Square to Trade or so. Thank you, Margaret. 12:43. Squeeze in at least one more. Leslie's in Camberley. Leslie, what's going on?
There's an entire housing estate going empty and going to rack and ruin and rotting.
Is it as simple as that, or would someone else say that is for a reason?
It's for a reason that is basically a big contractual mistake, shall we say. Do you know, obviously you must know, Deep Cut Barracks?
Yes.
The infamous? Well, it's been the actual barracks itself has been knocked down and a nice housing estate's been built.
Right.
But all the original housing for the married quarters and the officers' quarters is still standing. But it was originally built by a contractor and rented back to the government. It can't be handed back to the contractor until every single house is vacated. And there's one or two people living there.
That's what I thought I was going to find out.
There.
But there's not a lot. There's not a lot you can do about that, though, is there? There's not a lot you can do about that.
There's not a lot, but
except evict people who don't want to be evicted.
Well, they managed to evict 50 people just before Christmas.
Did they? I mean, So I mean, the rest of the housing is just falling apart, presumably, is it?
Completely falling apart. It's being set on fire by vandals.
This is one
metal
for
grills.
space finders.
Yeah.
I'd send them in
I
now.
walk the dog through it most nights. It's quite surreal because the actual outside of the houses are in good condition. Everything's just steel boarded up.
This is another example of something I can tell from your voice. You're just looking at it thinking, what the fig is going on? This is just ridiculous. I mean, there have been so many calls as well. It's more than an hour in the end, who just find it befuddling that the status quo is an unfortunate phrase. We probably use it too much, but the status quo is so broken. And I don't think, somewhat refreshingly, it's necessarily the fault of a political party. It's certainly not the fault of Brexit or the fault, but it's just odd that you could be looking at, we go back to where we began, you're looking at a housing crisis, a countrywide housing crisis. And in London alone, 30,000 empty properties. And you just think, surely you can knit those two statistics together to create an altogether better situation. Thank you, Leslie. It's 12:45. I've got a cool guest for you next. Otto English has written a book called Fake Heroes, 10 False Icons and How They Altered the Course of History. And if I tell you who the 10 false icons are, I don't know why I'm saying icon. Why did I say icon? I said it twice then. I caught myself saying it the first time, and then I thought, make sure you say icon the next time, otherwise no one will know what you're talking about. And then the next time came around, I said icon again. It's very strange, isn't it, the human brain? Anyway, it's really good, and it speaks to a lot of stuff I find interesting. If I said to you, looking at the list of 10 icons that Otto has identified as perhaps being somewhat better treated by history than they deserve to be. If I told you that it's the first time I've felt what other people must feel when the National Trust, for example, starts putting up signs explaining the history of the building, that the real and genuine history of the building that you're actually visiting. And for some reason, it just sort of sows a seed of grievance and resentment in the soul of a visitor. I just had a tiny little glimpse of that when I saw a couple of the names on this list. So I'm beginning maybe to understand what it's like to not like history that you don't like. But it's a brilliant book. We'll find out more after this. It's 10 to 1. Don't forget that Wes Streeting is joining Sheila at 1 o'clock today. And in fact, I've finished with my phone lines now. So do you want to start early to book a place? Do you mind doing that, Eleanor? Because it's not really your sort of... but what will you get? Will you get a bit of commission? Will Sheila sort you out with a cup of tea? Because I don't want you answering. Oh, you were going to put your feet up now and listen to the interview with Otto English about his new book. And now you're going to be answering phones from people who want to talk to Wes. All right, on your head be it. If you want to put a question to Wes Streeting, the number you need is 0345 6060973, and he will, of course, be joining Sheila Fogarty shortly after the 1 o'clock news. OK, here are the 10 names. The fake heroes, according to Otto English, who is, I'm told, a fully paid-up member of the tofu-eating Wokarati. Is it Bader or Barder?
I'm fully paid.
You are? I know. I know about that. I follow you on Twitter like a lot. Is it Bader or Barder?
Oh, Barder.
I thought it was. Yeah, no, I thought it was. So Douglas Bader, fake hero. John F. Kennedy, fake hero. Che Guevara, fake hero. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, fake hero. Andy Warhol, Coco Chanel, Captain Scott, Henry V, Thomas Midgley, and John Wayne. Now, there's a couple of names on there that I'm not unduly shocked by. There are a couple I am quite shocked by, and there is at least one I've never heard of. Who was Thomas Midgley?
Aha. I'm glad you asked that question, James O'Brien. Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome.
Thomas Midgley is the guy who, a brilliant scientist, who decided to put lead in petrol, and having completed this brilliant innovation, which changed our world, he invented CFCs. Yeah.
Oh. Well, so
as you can imagine, everybody at the time said, "Oh, lead's a marvellous thing in petrol. It stops the knocking on your engine." And
is that what it was put there for? As a sort of lubricant type, sort of?
Well, engines knocked, so before they put lead in it, the engine.
But he wasn't to know that it was going to have terrible.
He knew.
He did know.
He knew. And not only did he know, he'd been poisoned by lead whilst he was developing the product.
Right.
So they put this incredibly poisonous product out. All of the vested interests and oil and everybody said it's a brilliant thing. It's going to make your lives better.
Did they have think tanks in those days?
So this is the weird thing was they convened as everybody in the factory started to get poisoned and imagine that butterflies were flying in front of their eyes and one guy ran and jumped out of a fifth-story window because he'd gone completely mad.
Yes.
They convened one of those kind of conferences that they convene nowadays where experts brought in by the oil companies declared that it was all perfectly safe and everybody was overreacting. And my favourite thing, it was the fault of the employees for not taking it seriously.
For not taking proper precautions. Well, plus ça change. And there, of course, is perhaps the rationale behind the entire book in the gulf that sometimes exists between what we think we know and what is actually true. I don't know that we'll have time to run through all 10 of them. So do you have well, first of all, why did you want to write this book? I know your last book, Fake History, did very well, which looked at sort of 10 massive liars, really, from our past. It was particularly timely because of the political environment at the time. How did you pick these 10?
Well, I took a chocolate box approach. I thought I'll have a religious figure, I'll have a political figure, I'll have a military figure, I'll have a scientist. And so I kind of selected a chocolate box of heroes. And I also selected people that I thought everybody had heard of.
Apart from Thomas Midgley.
That was originally going to be Edison, but I've changed it to Midgley. So I picked people that everyone had vaguely heard of. So everybody kind of vaguely knows there's something about Mother Teresa that's not quite right.
Yes.
Everybody obviously everyone vaguely knows there's something about Che Guevara that's not quite right.
Will you say that? What is it about Che Guevara that's not quite right? Was he a sort of a PR creation as opposed to an actual?
So in each chapter, I've got the fake hero. So in that case, it's Che Guevara, and then I've got the person you've probably never quite heard of who did something heroic, and that's the only chapter where the same person features twice.
Oh yeah,
because young Che Guevara, reading it, he reminded me of all those idealistic people you meet at university, right? Like a properly idealistic young guy who goes out to make a better world, and then goes on what I describe in the book as like the most bizarre extended gap year in history, which ends up with him being a revolutionary in Cuba and all that came with it, and he just became a tyrant, a bit like, we were talking off air just before I came on, a bit like we were talking about people who go down a right rabbit hole of extremism. That is basically what happened to Che Guevara.
I shall let people guess who we may have been talking about specifically. I was slightly wary when a guest says, as we were just talking about off air, and I went, shut up, shush, no. Anyway, no names, no pack drill. You're right. There are little niggling thoughts in the back of my mind that I should know more about why these people have been treated rather better by history than perhaps they should have been. So we've mentioned Che Guevara. With John F. Kennedy, is it personal life versus political life, or do you go into areas that will take people by surprise?
I think because Kennedy has become like this sort of shining beacon to liberals everywhere of like the guy, the whole Camelot. I talk about how the whole Camelot myth was formed. Actually, it was formed because of the musical Camelot, which is quite interesting. But anyway, this kind of idea that this guy will fling open the doors on a better future and give us all hope. It's an extremely attractive proposal, and he was an extremely attractive man. The trouble is, once in office, and again, this is something that will not be unfamiliar to any of us, he didn't really do anything. The myth that grew up after him was sort of based around that shiny promise of hope that never came, which is tragic, really, in its own way. And a fascinating fact, he was president of the United States of America for less time than Theresa May was Prime Minister of the UK. It's one of my standout facts in the book.
But he knocked Liz Truss into a cocked hat, though. Does that not exonerate him slightly from the accusation that he should have done more? Or are you just talking
around the civil rights thing so much, and I spent the summer in Boston and the East Coast of the United States going around the sort of shrines to Kennedy, and it was like visiting religious shrines, and they talk up all the civil rights stuff, but he did nothing until the very, very last moment, and then chickened out even of that. So it's a myth, really, that he was the man he was, sadly.
And final question, what drives you to do this? Why does it fall to you to shine the lights into these corners?
I like picking fun. No,
that's a good reason.
I think I don't like people being lied to. We've all been lied to these last 6, 7, 8 years, and we've been lied to in our history. And there are people who would rather we just carried on believing in this series of myths, whether they be political or historic. And I think it's beholden to people like us to kind of pull back the doors and say, that's the real story. You can believe the myth if you like, but that's the truth. I think it's just more interesting as well.
It's out now. Fake Heroes, 10 False Icons and How They Altered the Course of History. I'm going to read the list again, actually, because I think it's Douglas Bader, John F. Kennedy, Che Guevara. Do you know he was Irish? Well, of course you know he was Irish.
Well, his great-grandfather.
But he's in the Museum of Immigration in Ireland, which out of everybody who's in it was the one I was least expecting to see. Mother Teresa, Andy Warhol, Coco Chanel, Captain Scott, Henry V, Thomas Midgley and John Wayne. Fake Heroes, 10 False Icons and How They Altered the Course of History by Otto English is out now. Wes Streeting is standing by. That's it from me for today. If you've missed any of today's show, you can download it, catch up on Global Player. All our shows are there, as well as the latest news from LBC. So rewind live radio on Global Player. Download it for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick with you at 4. Sheila Fogarty.
Come on, you can do it.
Sheila Fogarty is with you now.
I am. Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
James Obrien. 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 James